I was 38 that year, and I had just come off a rough stretch of nonstop work. I'd been grinding through construction contracts for almost 9 months straight, trying to keep ahead of bills after the split with my ex. She took the house, and I didn't fight her on it. I just needed to keep moving, keep earning. But by the time September came around, my back hurt all the time, and my hands were stiff in the mornings. I was burned out. My buddy Jeff had told me about this place in northern Idaho, a cabin near Lake Pendo Rile, way off the beaten path, past Sandpoint. He'd stayed there a couple of years earlier, said it was peaceful, dead quiet, surrounded by nothing but trees. That's exactly what I needed. No people, no phones, no traffic, just trees, water, and time to sit still for once. The place was old, owned by some guy named Arnold who lived out in Washington and rented it for dirt cheap as long as you didn't mind a little dust and the occasional squirrel getting into the attic. I didn't. I packed up my gear, loaded some canned food, a couple coolers with sandwich meat and water, and headed out. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I was taking a break for a couple weeks. The drive from Spokane took about 3.5 hours. The roads got thinner the farther north I went, and by the time I turned off onto the narrow dirt path Arnold had marked in the instructions, I was already out of cell service. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt. I followed the road slowly, avoiding potholes and thick roots that had pushed up through the packed earth. It felt like I was going nowhere for the longest time. Just endless forest and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Eventually, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat in a small patch of grass, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees, their leaves already starting to turn yellow. It wasn't big, just a single-story structure with a wide porch out front and a tin chimney poking out the top. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in a while, which was fine by me. I didn't need fancy, just quiet. I parked a few feet away, grabbed my bag, and walked up the creaking porch steps. The key was under a rusted coffee can, just like Arnold had said. Inside, the place smelled musty, but not bad. Just that old wood smell you get from places that sit empty too long. There were 2 rooms, a main living area with a small wood stove, a kitchen counter, and a worn couch, and a back room with a bed and a single window looking out into the trees. I spent the first couple hours airing the place out and getting set up. The windows opened, but they were stiff and I had to force a few. There was no electricity, just some oil lamps and a pile of chopped wood stacked next to the stove. I checked the cabinets. A few mice had gotten into them, but otherwise it was clean. I dumped my food into a cooler in the shade outside and unpacked my clothes. That night, I lit the stove and sat on the porch in a camping chair with a flashlight and a book, listening to the wind and the soft creak of the trees around me. It was perfect. The first few days were the best sleep I'd had in years. I woke up to birds instead of trucks or sirens. I spent mornings hiking around the lake, fishing off the rocks, or just lying in the grass doing nothing. My back started to loosen up, and the constant noise in my head began to quiet down. I didn't keep track of the days. I didn't care. Then, around the 5th or 6th night, things started to feel off. I remember waking up suddenly just after midnight. The room was dark except for the soft red glow from the stove in the other room. I didn't know why I woke up at first. There wasn't a sound. No wind. No animals. Just dead silence. That kind of silence you don't get in the city. I lay still, breathing slow, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. It wasn't a nightmare. I hadn't been dreaming. It was like my body knew something I didn't. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and walked out into the main room. The fire had burned down low. I added a couple logs and checked the front door. It was locked. The windows were all shut. Nothing looked moved, but the feeling didn't go away. It sat in my chest like pressure, like when a storm's about to hit and the air gets heavy. I sat on the couch for a while, trying to shake it off. Eventually, I went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I went farther into the woods than I had before. There was an old logging trail that cut east from the lake, and I followed it a couple miles in. The trees were thicker out there. I didn't see any animals, not even birds, just quiet, and that wasn't normal. At one point, I stopped to tie my boot, and I could swear I heard something snap, like a branch underfoot. maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. I stood still, listening, but nothing followed. I chalked it up to nerves and kept walking. When I got back to the cabin late that afternoon, I noticed something odd. The door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I always double-checked, especially out here. Nothing was missing inside, but one of the oil lamps was on the floor. Not broken, just lying there sideways. I didn't remember leaving it like that. Again, I tried to tell myself I had made a mistake. Maybe I was tired or distracted. But that old feeling came back, that pressure, that quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. I started sleeping with the hatchet next to the bed after that, just in case. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon had figured out the door latch, though that didn't make much sense. I even set up a small string tied to the door handle with a spoon on it, so if anything opened it, I'd hear it fall. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the spoon hitting the floor. I froze. My eyes were wide open before I even knew I was awake. There was no wind, no storm, just the soft clatter of the metal spoon on wood. Then nothing. I didn't move right away. I just lay there, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my arms. After maybe 30 seconds, I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I clicked it on and opened the bedroom door slowly. The main room was empty. The door was cracked open about 3 inches. The spoon lay on the floor right where I had expected, but nothing else was touched. The lamp still sat on the table. The fire had burned low again. I stepped outside into the cold, aiming the flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just endless black trunks and darkness. I turned in a slow circle, listening, but all I heard was my own breathing. I shut the door, locked it again, and pushed the couch in front of it. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I checked for tracks. The dirt outside the porch was packed hard, but I thought I saw something near the edge of the trees. It wasn't clear, just a soft indent like a boot print, but it didn't have enough detail to be sure. I told myself it could have been mine from before, but I wasn't convinced. I didn't go hiking that day. I spent it sitting on the porch, watching the tree line. The following night, it happened again. This time, I didn't hear the spoon fall. I just woke up, same as before, feeling that weight in the air. I walked out, and the door was open again, wider this time, maybe 6 inches. The couch had been nudged slightly, not pushed aside, but moved, just enough to let the door open a crack. The fire had been out for hours. I took the flashlight and stepped outside barefoot, staying on the porch. I didn't go more than 2 steps. I scanned the trees. I was shaking. Every sound felt louder, sharper. I was breathing too fast. Then I saw something, movement, about 20 feet out. Not an animal, not a bear or deer, person. They were standing between 2 trees, barely visible, but there, not moving. No flashlight, no gear, just a dark outline standing still, watching me. I didn't speak. I just backed into the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. I pushed the couch back in place and dragged the table over too. I didn't sleep. I sat with the hatchet in my lap until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I packed everything. I shoved my gear into the bag, left the food, didn't care. I didn't even check the back room. I just got out. The drive back felt like a dream. Every bump in the road made me jump. I didn't stop until I hit Sandpoint. I sat in a gas station parking lot for half an hour, just breathing. Then I got coffee and drove the rest of the way back to Spokane. When I got home, I locked every window, every door, and didn't sleep for 2 days. I don't know who it was. I'll never know. And that's the worst part. They didn't steal anything. They didn't try to talk or break in loudly. They just stood there, came into the cabin when I was asleep, watched, listened, maybe more. I told myself I'd report it, but what could I say? I didn't have a name, no photo, no evidence, just a feeling, a sound, a door slowly opening, a shadow in the trees. I never went back. I never will, and I always lock every door now, twice. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend some time alone in the wilderness. I was 27 years old, working a stressful job in marketing, and needed to clear my head. The place I chose was a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, a place I had heard was beautiful but not too far from civilization. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cooler temperatures, a small camping stove, enough food for 5 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a headlamp, extra batteries, a reliable pocket knife, and my hiking boots that had seen better days but still held up. I left early on a Thursday morning, taking a small highway that eventually narrowed to dirt roads and then to hiking trails. The car was full of everything I needed, and I had maps printed just in case I lost signal on my phone. Once I parked at the trailhead, I strapped on my backpack and started walking in. The air was fresh and smelled of pine and damp earth. The forest was dense, full of tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight, and the sounds of birds and insects filled the air. The trail was well marked but not crowded. I found a nice spot to set up camp near a small creek that trickled gently through the rocks. It was about 3 miles from the trailhead, far enough to feel isolated but close enough to get back quickly if I needed. I cleared an area, pitched my tent, and gathered firewood. The day passed with me exploring the nearby woods, taking pictures of the wildflowers and watching a pair of deer drink from the creek. When night fell, I built a fire, cooked some dehydrated chili, and lay back on my sleeping pad, staring at the stars peeking through the gaps in the canopy. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. I woke early each morning to the sound of birds and the soft splash of the creek. I filled my water bottle, boiled water on my stove for coffee, and spent the days hiking along the trail, enjoying the solitude. It felt good to be away from noise and people. I was careful to keep the fire contained, to respect the wildlife, and to keep my campsite clean. On the 3rd night, something changed. The weather had turned cooler and wetter, with clouds rolling in from the west. I noticed that the forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Around dusk, while gathering firewood, I heard something. Faint footsteps, crunching leaves, a snap of a twig far off in the woods. I stopped and listened, but everything went quiet again. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. After all, the forest was full of life. Back at camp, I secured my food in a bear-proof container I had brought. Even though I hadn't seen any signs of bears so far, I made a small fire and sat close, watching the flames. I felt the air grow colder and the wind pick up. Then I heard it again, footsteps, this time closer. Not the light step of an animal but heavier, crunching through dead leaves and small branches. I looked into the dark forest beyond the firelight, but I could see nothing. I turned on my headlamp and shined it into the woods. The beam pierced the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. I waited quietly, holding my breath, hoping the sounds would stop. Instead, they grew louder and closer. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a big branch breaking nearby. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my knife and stood up, shining the light around. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure moving between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. The thought of someone else being out here, unannounced, made me uneasy. I had not seen another person since I arrived. I decided to pack up some of my food and my valuables, just in case, and put everything in my car. I also checked my phone, hoping for a signal to call someone, but there was none. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could be a lost hunter or a hiker like me, but the forest felt different now, more oppressive. The isolation I had welcomed earlier suddenly felt like a trap. The wind howled through the trees, and the fire flickered. I stayed up most of the night, eyes scanning the darkness, ears straining for any noise. Every little sound made me jump. At one point, I heard something breathing heavy and uneven, somewhere just beyond the ring of firelight. I grabbed a rock and held it tight. As dawn approached, the noises stopped. The birds began to sing again, and the forest lightened. I lay back down, exhausted but unable to sleep well. The next day, I packed quickly and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The woods seemed quieter, almost too quiet. I moved fast, feeling eyes on me but never seeing anyone. When I reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I packed up everything and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest. Something about the whole experience stayed with me. A reminder that nature is beautiful but also unpredictable and sometimes dangerous because of other people, not the wilderness itself. The fear I felt was not from ghosts or monsters, but from the real and unknown threat of another human out there, watching, moving quietly in the dark woods. I realized then that sometimes the scariest things in the wild are not the animals or weather, but the unknown intentions of people. I kept camping later on, but I always made sure to let someone know exactly where I was going, to carry a whistle, and to trust my instincts more. That trip taught me a lot about respect for nature and caution about who or what might be sharing that space. It was mid-September 2017. I was 33 years old at the time and going through one of those phases where everything felt like it was stuck. I'd quit my job in Minneapolis a few months earlier after things fell apart with my boss, and I hadn't found anything steady since. I was bouncing between small freelance gigs, none of which gave me enough of a reason to stay locked in the city. The only good thing going on was that I finally had time to get out and do something I'd always wanted: go on a long solo camping trip. Nothing fancy, just me, a tent, some basic supplies, and a few days of silence away from everything. I decided to head north, away from the noise, into the Superior National Forest. I'd only been up there once, years ago, on a short hike with some friends. This time, I wanted something more remote. I found a small lake on a topographic map, Lake Harlan, which didn't show up on Google Maps unless you zoomed in real close. There weren't any marked campgrounds around it, and the nearest ranger station was over 15 miles away. It sounded perfect. I packed carefully, a 4-person tent, even though I was going solo just for comfort. A good sleeping bag, one of those inflatable sleeping pads, a water filter, a hatchet, a solid survival knife, a pot for boiling water, dehydrated meals, energy bars, bear spray, and a small solar charger for my phone. Not that I expected to have signal out there. I brought a lighter, waterproof matches, and a small fire starter just in case. I even threw in a paperback novel and a small notebook I rarely wrote in. I left early on a Wednesday morning. The drive was long and uneventful, and I spent most of it sipping gas station coffee and watching the trees get taller and thicker the farther north I went. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead I'd picked out. It wasn't an official parking area, just a small dirt pull-off along a logging road. I locked up the car, made sure everything was strapped down in my pack, and started walking. The hike was about 6 miles through mostly flat terrain. The forest there was deep and quiet, with towering pines and thick underbrush. I had to step over fallen logs and push through brush at times, but I kept a steady pace. I saw a few animal tracks along the way. Deer, some kind of canine, but nothing I hadn't seen before. The further I went, the more alone I felt. Not in a bad way, just aware of the quiet. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your ears a bit, like the woods were holding their breath. I reached the lake just before sunset. It was smaller than I'd expected, but beautiful. The water was still and glassy, reflecting the trees perfectly. There was a small clearing on the north side, about 30 feet from the shore, just big enough for my tent, and a fire ring made of rocks someone else must have built years ago. I could tell no one had used it in a long time. The moss had crept halfway up the stones, and the ground was covered in dry needles. I set up the tent, boiled some water, and ate one of the freeze-dried meals while the sun dipped below the trees. The first night was peaceful. I laid in the tent with the fly half open so I could see the stars. It was colder than I expected, but I had enough layers. I fell asleep listening to the wind moving through the tops of the trees and the occasional plop of a fish jumping in the lake. The second day passed in that kind of quiet haze you only get in the woods. I explored around the lake, found a little stream feeding into it from the south, and filtered water there. I collected dry wood, sharpened the edge of my knife, and spent some time sitting by the fire pit, just thinking. I even scribbled in the notebook for a bit, mostly boring stuff, like how the firewood was damp or how still the lake looked. Around late afternoon, I noticed something a little strange, but I didn't think too much of it. Across the lake, on the far shore, I thought I saw some movement. Not a person, just something large, maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I only caught a glimpse through the trees. Whatever it was, it didn't reappear. That night, things started to feel different. Not dangerous, just off. I had a harder time falling asleep. There were more sounds. Sticks snapping, rustling in the underbrush near the tent. I told myself it was raccoons or squirrels. The bear spray was right next to me, just in case. Eventually I drifted off, but I kept waking up every hour or two. On the third day, I felt tired. I stuck close to the camp, only walking down to the water a couple of times to filter more. I noticed a set of tracks near the shoreline that hadn't been there before. Bigger than deer. The shape wasn't right either. I crouched to look closer. They looked like boot prints. Heavy ones, maybe from someone wearing hiking boots, but older and sunken into the moss as if they'd been there longer than a day. I looked around the shoreline but didn't see anyone. I felt a flicker of unease. Not fear exactly, just that sense that you're not as alone as you thought. That night was worse. Around 1 a.m, I woke up to the sound of something moving near the tent. Not a small animal, something heavier. The kind of sound made when someone shifts their weight slowly on dry pine needles. I stayed completely still. The fire had burned out, and the moonlight was too weak to see anything clearly through the mesh. I listened, heart racing, for a long time. Then silence. Not the normal kind, but that heavy, waiting kind again. After what felt like an hour, I fell asleep again, but it was restless and shallow. In the morning, I stepped outside and checked the area. I didn't see any footprints around the tent, but the firewood I'd stacked neatly the evening before had been disturbed. Some pieces were knocked over, one tossed a few feet from the pile. I tried to tell myself an animal had done it, maybe looking for bugs or something. But in my gut, I didn't believe that. I debated leaving that day, packing up and hiking back out. But I told myself I'd stay 4 nights, and I didn't want to back down over some noises. I convinced myself it was nerves, the isolation getting to me, so I stayed. That 4th evening, I decided to keep the fire going late, just for the light. I sat close to it for hours, tossing in small branches and trying not to let my imagination run wild. Around midnight, I heard it again, something moving in the trees. This time it was clearer, more deliberate. I held my breath. The sound stopped, then started again, closer. Not charging, not running, just slow, careful steps. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in the tent with the bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other, ears straining in the darkness. Nothing else happened, but the quiet didn't feel natural anymore. Felt watched, like something out there was waiting for me to sleep again. The first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even filter more water. I just stuffed the gear into my pack, stomped out the last of the fire, and started hiking back toward the car. The trail felt different. The trees seemed to lean closer, the underbrush thicker. I moved fast but tried not to make too much noise. About 2 miles in, I stopped for a minute to adjust my pack. That's when I noticed it. A piece of tree bark near the base of a pine had been stripped off, fresh, with a vertical scrape down the middle, like someone had dragged a blade across it. I looked around and saw another tree about 15 feet away with the same kind of scrape. I didn't wait. I started walking faster, almost jogging at times. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. Twigs snapping, branches moving. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know. It took me less than 2 hours to reach the car. When I finally saw it through the trees, I broke into a full sprint. The car was untouched. I jumped in, locked the doors, started it, and drove for miles before I pulled over to breathe. I never saw anyone. I never saw anything. But I know I wasn't alone out there. Something or someone had been watching, maybe even following me. I'll never know who or what it was. A hunter gone too deep into the woods? Someone living off the grid who didn't want company? Or something worse, someone who liked watching people come out there alone, vulnerable, unaware. I haven't been camping since. I still go on hikes, short ones, in familiar places, but I won't sleep in the woods anymore. Not alone. Not where help is hours away. Whatever peace I was looking for out there, it was buried under something darker. Something quiet and patient that waits in places we think are empty. And I won't go looking for it again. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything and head out to the mountains for a few weeks. It was early October of 2019, and the last few years had just worn me out. My job in Dallas had become a grind. My friends were either getting married or moving away, and I hadn't taken more than a weekend off in almost 2 years. I didn't want to go somewhere tropical or busy. I wanted to be alone, just somewhere cold and quiet with no traffic and no schedule. So I rented a small off-grid cabin up in northwestern Montana, about 40 minutes west of a town called Libby. The listing said it was a one-room cabin with a small loft for sleeping, no running water, and solar power for lights. It had a wood stove and a basic propane burner for cooking, and it came with a big stack of chopped firewood. The pictures showed it sitting at the end of a narrow dirt trail, nestled among thick pine trees, with no neighbors in sight. It looked perfect. The owner gave me a simple set of instructions for check-in, told me there was no cell service anywhere nearby, and that I should bring enough food for the entire stay. I packed canned soup, pasta, rice, trail mix, coffee, oatmeal, and about 5 gallons of drinking water. I also packed some basic tools, a hatchet, a flashlight, and a pistol I kept for safety when hiking alone. I didn't expect to need it, but I figured better safe than sorry. The drive up from Dallas took 2 days. I stopped overnight in Casper, Wyoming, then pushed through the last 8 hours to Montana the next morning. It was cold by the time I got near Libby, high 40s in the afternoon, dropping into the 30s at night. Leaves were falling, the trees up in the hills already bare in some places. When I finally turned off the paved road and followed the narrow gravel path that led toward the cabin, I could feel everything slowing down inside me. The dirt trail was rough and climbed steadily uphill. My tires kicked up dust and pine needles as I drove through a canopy of tall lodgepole pines, golden larches, and a few Douglas firs that still clung to their needles. The sun filtered through the branches in long, sharp beams. The cabin was just like the pictures, maybe even a little better. It was small, maybe 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a covered porch, dark brown log walls, and a silver chimney pipe sticking up through the roof. The windows had wooden shutters that could be latched from inside. The door was solid and heavy, and the padlock opened with the combination the owner had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled like old pine, smoke, and a hint of kerosene. There was a cot-style bed up in the loft, a table and 2 chairs downstairs, some open shelving, and a compact little kitchen area. I unpacked my gear, set up my sleeping bag upstairs, and lit a fire in the stove to chase out the cold. By the time the sun went down, it was warm and quiet inside, with the sound of wind in the trees the only thing I could hear outside. For the first 2 days, it was exactly what I needed. I chopped more firewood, hiked a little on the nearby trails, cooked simple meals, and read a book by the light of a solar lantern. I kept my phone off, even though it wouldn't have worked anyway. I slept deeply each night, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in years. There was no traffic, no emails, no background noise, just silence and the occasional rustle of wildlife outside. It was on the 3rd night that things started to feel off. Nothing big at first, just a small sound, barely noticeable. I was lying upstairs in the loft, half asleep, when I thought I heard a crunch outside. Not wind, not the creak of wood, but something stepping on leaves or twigs. I sat up slowly and listened. It didn't repeat, just silence. Maybe a deer or raccoon, I thought. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to stretch and walk around a bit. The ground was damp from some light rain overnight, and I noticed a few faint impressions in the dirt near the back of the cabin. At first, I figured they were just from a squirrel or maybe a fox, but one of them looked off. It was deeper, wider, and more deliberate, like a shoe print, but without clear tread marks. Almost like someone had been walking around out back in smooth-soled boots. I looked around the trees. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, just still woods and damp needles. I checked the door and windows, but everything was still locked from the inside. I told myself it was probably just my own track from when I'd walked around yesterday, maybe distorted by the rain. Still, I didn't like the feeling I had in my chest. That night, I brought the pistol upstairs with me and set it near the sleeping bag. I kept the fire low and the lantern off once I was settled, just in case anyone was outside watching. I stared at the ceiling for hours, barely blinking. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard it again, this time closer. A deliberate crunch, then another, then nothing. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't move like an animal. There were no sniffing sounds, no scampering. Just 2 slow steps, then silence. I stayed frozen in place, heart hammering, ears straining in the dark. I didn't get up. I didn't move. I just lay there, gun in hand, waiting. By morning, the ground outside was dry again, but I still found prints. This time, more of them. They led from the trees, circled the side of the cabin, then disappeared into the woods behind it. Definitely not animal prints. Long, narrow, heel-to-toe patterns that looked like a person walking slowly. Too big for a woman, but not huge. The toe of one dragged slightly, like maybe they had a limp. I crouched down and stared at them for a long time, just trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here? Why would someone be walking circles around a remote cabin at night? That day, I didn't go for a hike. I stayed close. I kept the pistol on my hip and gathered some large branches to lean against the windows from the inside. Not for protection exactly, but just so I'd hear if something pushed against them. I also moved the table in front of the front door. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, and the nearest house was probably 10 miles down a steep road that would be hard to drive in the dark. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to drive that trail at night. I decided to stay just one more night and head out first thing in the morning. That was a mistake. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft sound. Not footsteps this time, but something brushing gently against the outside of the wall. A soft, scraping drag. Not loud, but constant, like someone was slowly running a stick or knife down the logs of the cabin. My throat tightened. I slipped out of the sleeping bag, grabbed the pistol, and crouched low near the edge of the loft where I could peek down. I had left the lantern near the stove, unlit. The only light was from the dying fire. Shadows flickered faintly on the walls. The scraping stopped. Then a new sound, something tapping softly against the window glass. Not hard, not like trying to break in. Just light taps, like fingernails. I stayed completely still. The tapping moved from one window to the next. Tap, tap, then nothing. The rest of the night was dead silent. At first light, I packed everything in 10 minutes flat. I didn't even eat. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the car, and drove out of there faster than I should have. My tires skidded on loose gravel and caught in small ruts, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get down the mountain. Back in Libby, I stopped at a diner and used their Wi-Fi to message the cabin owner. I didn't go into details, just said there was evidence someone had been walking around the property at night and that I was leaving early. He replied 2 hours later and said I was the only renter on the calendar that week. He hadn't been up to the cabin in months. I didn't go to the police. I had no solid evidence, just footprints, sounds, and fear. Nothing was stolen, no one got hurt, and I had no license plate or name. Just someone or something out in the woods who knew that cabin was alone. I went back to Texas and tried to forget it. I threw away the clothes I'd worn up there. I didn't talk about it. I didn't go camping for a long time after that. But sometimes, even now, when I'm lying in bed in my apartment, I'll think I hear that sound again, the light tapping on glass. And I'll remember how out there, in the middle of nowhere, with no phone, no neighbors, and no help, someone was walking around my cabin in the dark, not trying to get in, just watching. And for me, that was worse. I was 34 the year I decided to take a solo trip up to a remote cabin near Iron River, Michigan. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just finished a long stretch of project work for a landscaping company I co-owned with a buddy from college. Business was good, but the last 6 months had been a constant grind. Early mornings, weekend jobs, endless paperwork. I felt drained and unmotivated. I needed something to break the routine, something quiet and far away from the noise of work, phones, and responsibilities. I found the cabin through a listing on a small Midwestern rental site. It was owned by a retired couple who had moved to Florida and were barely using it anymore. It sat on about 25 acres of forest, with a gravel road leading a few miles in from the main highway. It had no internet, no TV, and no cell service. Just a generator, a wood stove, a propane tank, and a small dock that jutted out onto a quiet lake. No neighbors, no traffic, no sounds except whatever the woods decided to offer. That was exactly what I wanted. I left on a Wednesday morning, packed my truck with 5 days worth of food, clothes, firewood, and some tools just in case something broke. It was an 8-hour drive from where I lived in southern Wisconsin. I rolled in just after 6 p.m., with the sun still hanging in the sky and the smell of pine heavy in the air. The gravel driveway curved up and around a small hill before leveling out in front of the cabin. It was a simple A-frame with dark brown siding and a green tin roof. A small porch looked out over the lake. There was a detached shed nearby, with a couple of old canoes leaned up against it and a stack of firewood under a tarp. I got the generator going, unpacked what I needed, and spent the first evening just settling in. I cooked a simple meal on the propane stove, sat on the porch, and watched the water. The lake was dead calm, glassy, and still. Somewhere across the water, a loon called out. That night, I fell asleep hard and fast in the little bedroom tucked up in the loft, the window open to the warm summer air. The second day was quiet, just like I wanted. I walked the trails that looped around the cabin's property, following deer paths and old logging roads. I saw fresh tracks. Deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote, but nothing else. No people, no movement. I didn't even see a plane overhead. It was like the world outside had gone quiet. I cooked eggs and bacon in the morning, sandwiches for lunch, and pasta in the evening. I read a paperback I had brought, wrote in a small journal I kept, and watched the water again as the sun went down. Still no ripples, no boats, just silence. It was on the third day that I noticed something a little off. I was out early, just after breakfast. The air was cool, the kind of chill that clings to the trees before the sun gets high enough to burn it off. I decided to take a longer walk, deeper into the woods than before. I followed a narrow game trail down through a small ravine and then up the other side, moving slow to avoid tripping on roots and rocks. I hadn't seen any signs of human activity so far. No rappers, no old campsites, not even tree markings. But that morning, I saw something strange just off the path. It was a single boot, a muddy, faded tan work boot, sitting upright, half-tucked beneath some undergrowth. It wasn't rotten or falling apart, but it didn't look new either. The laces were missing. It looked like it had been there a while. At first, I figured it had been lost by a hunter or logger years ago. But then I realized it was facing directly toward the trail, like someone had stepped out of it mid-walk and left it there. I picked it up. It was heavy, soaked at the bottom, but no obvious tears or damage. No animal bites, no chewed up leather, just abandoned. I carried it for a bit, unsure what to do with it, then left it on a flat rock so it wouldn't get swallowed by the woods again. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the boot, about how there hadn't been a matching one nearby. No bones, no scraps of clothing, just that one, left in a place that didn't feel right. I told myself not to dwell on it. Maybe someone had dropped it from a pack, maybe it was left behind years ago and the forest had just pushed the other one under, but something about it sat heavy in my mind. I woke up twice that night, once around midnight, then again closer to 3. The second time, I thought I heard something outside the cabin. A soft crunching sound, like leaves being stepped on. But it was faint, and by the time I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing, just trees and moonlight. I chalked it up to a raccoon or a deer passing by. The next morning, I walked back to where I had found the boot. It was gone. The rock was still there. I recognized the shape, the moss on the side, even the weird crack running across it. But the boot I had left sitting on top was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, checked the bushes, walked a little up and down the trail. Nothing, no sign of it. The ground didn't look disturbed. No drag marks, no prints. It was just gone, like I had never touched it. That day, I didn't hike as far. I stayed closer to the cabin, kept busy chopping wood and stacking it even though I already had plenty. I cleaned the porch, checked the shed, rechecked the generator. Anything to stay active, but my brain kept spinning. By sunset, I was watching the tree line across the lake. Not the water, not the sky, just the shadows moving between the trees. I started noticing patterns in the bark. Lines that didn't look natural, cracks that looked too even. I told myself I was just overthinking, that I needed rest. That night, I brought one of the axes inside. I had no reason. Nothing had happened, but I didn't like how it felt. The silence had turned from peaceful to heavy, like the air was watching me, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I locked the door, even though the nearest person was probably miles away. I didn't sleep much. Around 2:30, I heard something again. It was louder this time. Footsteps, clearly, slow, deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves just beyond the front porch. Then a pause, then another step, then nothing. I didn't move. I just sat up in bed, heart racing, barely breathing. I kept my eyes on the dark loft window. It was still open from earlier in the day, and I wondered if anything could climb up the roof and reach it. The generator had gone off hours ago, so the only light was from the moon. I didn't hear anything else that night. When morning finally came, I forced myself to go outside. I checked the ground around the porch. There were no clear prints, just soft indentations that could have been from anything. The kind of half-shapes leaves make when they shift overnight. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I had heard. I should have packed up then. I should have left. But I stayed. Told myself it was probably a deer, that the boot had just slipped off the rock and rolled away, that I was tired, not thinking clearly. I didn't want to look like a coward, not even to myself. I had told everyone I was going out to reset, to be alone in nature. Leaving early felt like quitting, like failure. That day, I didn't go into the woods at all. I stayed close, sat on the porch with the axe next to me. I didn't read. I didn't write. I just watched and listened. Around noon, I noticed something strange on the dock. There were scratches in the wood, shallow, maybe a few inches long, and spaced out unevenly. They hadn't been there before. I had walked down there 2 days earlier barefoot, and I would have seen or felt them. They were fresh, splintered around the edges, like someone had dragged something sharp across the planks. But they didn't go anywhere. Just a patch, maybe 2 feet wide, then nothing. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair downstairs, near the window that faced the woods. I kept the lights off, listened, watched. The axe stayed in my lap. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Not on the porch this time. Off to the right, in the woods beyond the shed. Soft, slow steps, then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Then a sharp tap on the far wall of the cabin. Just one. I didn't move. Another tap. Then footsteps. Then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, unmoving, barely breathing. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my things. Fast. I didn't eat, didn't clean. I threw everything into the truck, fired up the engine, and got the hell out. I didn't look back. I drove the full 8 hours without stopping more than once for gas. I didn't start to feel normal again until I hit the highway and saw other cars. A few weeks later, I called the owners to ask if anyone else had ever reported weird things out there. They said no. Said most people loved the quiet, the solitude. They asked if something was wrong. I lied. Said I just didn't sleep well up there. I didn't want to explain, but I knew what I had heard. I knew that boot hadn't walked off by itself. I knew those footsteps weren't in my head. Something or someone was out there. Not a ghost. Not some storybook monster. Just something real. Flesh and It was early October in 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 29 at the time and working a desk job in Columbus, Ohio. I had been staring at spreadsheets for 8 to 10 hours a day for the past 3 years, and the routine was eating me up slowly. The idea of just unplugging and getting away from city life had been on my mind for months. I didn't want to fly anywhere or go to a hotel or resort. I wanted real quiet, the kind that feels heavy in the air. I looked into rentals and eventually found a small off-grid cabin for rent in northern Michigan, near a place called Grayling, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. The cabin sat at the edge of a forest with no neighbors for miles, powered by a solar battery setup and heated by an old wood stove. There was no cell service or internet. That was exactly what I wanted. I booked the place for 10 days. The guy who owned it sent me a long email with directions and a few warnings. He told me to bring more food and water than I thought I needed, and he said the road leading up to the cabin could get muddy if it rained. He also mentioned that there were bears in the area and to store any trash inside or in the bear-proof bin out back. I printed out the directions and packed everything into my Subaru. Cans of soup, a couple of gallons of water, trail mix, instant coffee, a few books, and a hatchet I had bought at a hardware store a year ago but never used. I left early in the morning while it was still dark outside and started driving north. The first part of the drive was smooth, highways all the way. The second half was more rural, with smaller two-lane roads cutting through farmland and forest. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, following the printed directions. That last stretch was maybe 7 or 8 miles, and it was bumpy, full of potholes and surrounded by dense trees on both sides. I passed an old rusted-out truck on the side of the road at one point, half buried in tall grass. I didn't see another car the whole way in. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos, small, made of dark, weathered wood with a sloped tin roof and a single window out front. There was a tiny deck with 2 wooden chairs and a fire pit off to the side. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched out into nothing. I parked next to the cabin and got out. The air smelled like pine and wet leaves. Everything was quiet except for a few birds and the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was simple. One room with a bed, a little table and chair, a shelf with a few books and board games, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a battery-powered lantern on the table and a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a sink that worked with a hand pump, and a metal basin to catch water. I spent the first hour bringing in supplies from the car, unpacking, and getting settled. That first day was calm. I spent most of it walking around the clearing behind the cabin and exploring the edge of the forest. I didn't go in too deep. The trees were close together, and the ground was uneven with roots and rocks. I came back before the sun started going down. I heated up a can of soup on the stove, sat out on the deck while I ate, and then read by lantern light until I felt sleepy. I went to bed early, maybe around 9. The mattress was firmer than I liked, but I was tired enough that it didn't matter. The next few days followed a pattern. I would wake up early with the light coming in through the window, eat something simple like granola or instant oatmeal, and then either hike around the area or sit outside with a book. I didn't see any people, no hikers or hunters. I saw deer tracks a few times and heard what might have been coyotes far off one night, but that was it. It was peaceful. I felt like my brain was finally slowing down for the first time in years. On the 5th day, things started to feel a little off. It rained the night before, hard enough to drum against the roof and wake me up a few times. In the morning, the clearing was soaked, and the path into the woods looked darker than usual. I noticed footprints in the mud near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but they were deeper than mine and spaced differently. These weren't boot prints like mine either. They looked like regular sneakers. I crouched down and looked closely. It wasn't just one pair. There were at least 2 different sets. I followed them for a bit, maybe 20 yards into the trees, until they veered off and disappeared into thicker brush. That was far enough for me. I turned back and returned to the cabin. That day, I kept checking outside through the window without meaning to. I was trying to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe some hunters or hikers had come through, but the way the tracks circled around the edge of the clearing made me uncomfortable. They hadn't gone straight past the cabin like someone just passing through. They had walked a loop around it like they were checking it out. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up and listening for sounds. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something outside. Maybe footsteps, maybe just a branch falling. I couldn't be sure. I stayed in bed, under the covers, my ears straining for any noise. Nothing else happened, and I eventually dozed off again. In the morning, I checked the area around the cabin. There were new footprints, fresh ones, in the mud near the back corner of the building, close to where the firewood pile was. They hadn't been there the day before. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking every side. Nothing else looked disturbed. The trash bin out back was still closed. The firewood wasn't touched. The door was locked just as I had left it. Still, I felt something in my chest that wouldn't go away. A sort of tightness, like I couldn't breathe all the way in. I stayed close to the cabin the whole day, only going out to chop some more wood and collect water from the rain barrel. I didn't go into the woods again. That night was worse. I heard movement around midnight. Not just a single sound, but multiple. Crunching leaves. A dull thud like someone tripping or bumping into something. Then it stopped. Then started again. I got out of bed quietly and stood by the window, careful not to knock over the lantern. Couldn't see much. The moonlight was faint, and the forest cast long shadows across the clearing. But I thought I saw a shape near the edge of the trees. It wasn't an animal. It stood upright. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, barely breathing. Eventually, the shape stepped back into the trees and was gone. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I decided to leave early. I still had 3 days left, but I didn't care anymore. I packed everything back into the car as fast as I could and took one last walk around the cabin. That's when I noticed the woodpile had been moved. Some of the logs were shifted, and one of the larger pieces was split like someone had taken the hatchet to it. I hadn't done that. I checked inside, and the hatchet was there, in the same spot I had left it near the door, but it was dirty. Bits of bark stuck to the edge. The worst part was the small, square piece of cloth I found nailed to the back wall of the cabin, just under the roofline. It hadn't been there before. It looked like the corner of a t-shirt or rag, and someone had drawn a crude smiley face on it in marker. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining any of this. Someone had been watching me. Someone had come close enough to the cabin to leave things behind. I got in the car and started driving. The dirt road was even worse after all the rain, and I nearly got stuck twice, but I didn't stop. I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see anyone, but I still felt like I was being followed until I hit pavement again. I didn't report anything. I didn't call the owner. I just drove straight home. When I got back, I left all the gear in the car and went straight to my apartment. I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cloth nailed to the cabin wall or the figure at the edge of the trees. A few months later, I got curious and looked up the area. I found an article from the previous year about a man who had been found living off-grid in the woods near Grayling. He had broken into seasonal cabins for food and supplies. They said he was arrested after someone found signs of forced entry and called the police. He was never violent, but he had a long record of trespassing and squatting in remote homes. That didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it confirmed that people like that were out there, and one of them had found me alone in that cabin. I haven't gone camping since. I still get the urge to go back into the woods sometimes, but then I think about those footprints, the smiley face, and the sound of someone moving outside while I tried to sleep. Maybe someday I'll go back, but not alone. Never alone again. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone. I was 26, working a demanding office job in Chicago, and the city noise was getting to me. The idea was simple. I'd spend a few days out in nature, away from people, phones, and deadlines. I wanted silence and fresh air, maybe a little time to clear my head. I chose a remote spot in the northern part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I'd heard about a little-known camping area near a lake called Lake Superior's smaller cousin, Lake Gogebic. It was deep in the woods, far from highways, cell service barely worked, and the campground was mostly empty this time of year. Early August, just before the school year started again. Perfect. I packed my backpack the night before, checking and double-checking my gear. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cooler nights, a small portable stove, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, flashlight, matches, a map, and compass. I even brought a small hand axe and some paracord. I was careful. I'd never been camping alone for more than a night or two before. This time, I wanted to be fully prepared. The drive up was peaceful. The highway slowly dissolved into narrow roads lined with towering pine and spruce trees. The air grew fresher and cooler as I got closer. By late afternoon, I reached the campground, a small clearing near the lake's edge with a few scattered campsites. A few tents were up, but I could tell most people had left for the day. I picked a spot near the water, a bit off from the main path, under some tall trees that offered shade but not too thick to block the view of the lake. The ground was soft with pine needles, slightly damp but firm. I set up my tent quickly, making sure the rain flap was tight, then gathered some dry wood from nearby fallen branches. It smelled of fresh pine and earth. I felt a quiet thrill being out there, surrounded by nothing but trees, the occasional bird call, and the distant sound of the lake's gentle waves hitting the shore. The sun started dipping, painting the sky orange and pink. I made a small fire, cooking some dehydrated stew and boiling water for coffee. I sat close, watching the flames crackle, feeling the cool evening air settle in. After eating, I cleaned up, stuffed my trash in a bag, and put it high in a tree away from my tent to keep critters out. I wasn't expecting bears, but I'd heard stories, so I played it safe. I lay down in my sleeping bag inside the tent, my flashlight off, just listening. The forest sounds were alive. Wind in the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere far off, an owl's distant call. The night was clear and cold. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and eventually fell asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. The silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I'd fallen asleep to, but a heavier stillness. The kind that presses on you. I heard a faint noise outside my tent, like soft footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, my heart picking up pace. The sound stopped after a few seconds, then nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon wandering around. Still, I stayed awake for a while, listening closely, my fingers tightly gripping the flashlight. By dawn, the world outside lightened. The birds started singing again, and the night's tension slowly eased. I packed up my things slowly, had some coffee, and decided to explore a little before leaving. About a mile down the path, I found something odd. A small pile of broken branches and leaves, crushed and scattered, like someone or something had been there recently. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and I could see clear footprints pressed in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They looked human. That made my stomach twist. I looked around carefully, the trees thick on either side. No one was in sight. I checked my phone. No signal. No way to call anyone or check maps online. I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself. The footprints headed back toward the lake, toward my campsite. A cold feeling spread through me. I hurried back, scanning the forest. As I neared the campsite, I saw the fire pit was disturbed. The stones were scattered, some ashes thrown around. My backpack was still there, but the small bag of food I'd hung in the tree was missing. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my things and packed up fast. The sun was higher now, but the forest felt different, heavy and watchful. I wanted to leave immediately, but realized my car was parked almost 2 miles away at the entrance. I could walk back through the woods, but I had to go through the same path where I'd seen the footprints. I started walking quickly, eyes darting around, ears straining for any sound. The forest was alive with birds and insects, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. About halfway through, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. Not running, just slow, deliberate. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I waited, heart pounding so loud it seemed to echo in my ears. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was another camper or someone hiking. Maybe I was overreacting. I turned slowly, flashlight in hand, shining it between the trees. Nothing. The shadows stretched long and strange. I walked faster. Then I heard a low sound, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, or a soft rustle. Too soft to make out words. I kept walking, desperate now. The path opened up near a small clearing. There, on a fallen tree, I saw a crude carving. A circle with an X through it, scratched deep into the bark. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt wrong, like a warning. I didn't stop to look longer. I ran. Finally, after what felt like forever, I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, doors locked. I didn't even check inside. I jumped in, locked the doors behind me, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The trees faded behind me, and the feeling of being watched slowly left. That night in my apartment, I replayed everything over and over. Who had been out there? Why did they disturb my camp? What did the carving mean? I searched online for similar symbols but found nothing conclusive. The next day, I called the park office. They told me the area was mostly quiet, but sometimes hikers reported strange encounters. Unexplained noises, seeing figures in the distance. Nothing violent, they said, just odd. They advised hikers to stay on marked trails and report anything suspicious. I never went back to that spot. I never camped alone again. Looking back, I realized how naive I was to think I could be completely alone in the woods without risk. The forest isn't empty. People are out there. Some mean no harm, some might just be lost, but others, maybe they're watching, waiting for the right moment. What scared me most wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was the knowledge that I wasn't alone, that someone had been close enough to touch my camp, close enough to know I was there, and that I'd never heard them coming. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a week camping alone in the remote woods of northern Michigan. I was 27, and the stress from my job in the city had been piling up for months. The constant noise, the endless emails, and the crowded subway rides made me feel trapped, suffocated even. So, I packed up my gear: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, cooking stove, plenty of water, and some canned food, and set out for a small forest called the Pine Ridge Preserve, a place known for its dense trees, quiet trails, and little foot traffic. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday. The forest was still warm from the day, but the air was cool and sharp with the smell of pine and earth. I chose a spot near a slow-moving creek, the ground flat and clear of thick brush. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were deep and the rainfly was tight. As I worked, I noticed the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the bushes nearby. The forest felt alive but calm, the kind of place where the modern world fell away. After setting up camp, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. The stack wasn't large, but enough for a few hours of warmth and light. I was alone, and part of me liked that. The quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely disconnected. I started the fire with some matches and kindling I had brought, watching the flames flicker and grow, throwing shadows on the tall trees. That night, I lay on my sleeping pad inside the tent, listening to the creek's gentle burble mixed with the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt peaceful, a rare thing for me. But things changed the next day. I had planned to hike a trail that looped around the ridge, about 7 miles long, and take photos of the wildflowers and landscape. The trailhead was about 2 miles from my camp. I packed my day bag with water, some snacks, my camera, and a map I had printed out. The weather was clear, the sky a bright blue, and the forest canopy filtered the sunlight into a warm green glow. As I walked, the trail was easy at first, soft dirt underfoot, with pine needles and scattered stones. I saw a few deer tracks in the mud and heard woodpeckers tapping nearby. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and after about an hour, I came to a small clearing. The sun hit the clearing fully, and I stopped to rest and drink some water. The silence here was profound. No planes, no cars, just the forest breathing around me. I checked my map. According to it, I was halfway through the loop, about 3.5 miles from my camp. I felt confident and decided to keep going. But then, after a few minutes of walking again, I noticed something strange. The trail began to feel less maintained. Branches blocked parts of the path, and the dirt looked more disturbed, as if animals or people had walked off it recently. I looked closer and saw faint footprints in the mud that weren't mine. They were bigger than mine and heavier. I couldn't tell exactly what made them, but they weren't deer or any normal forest creature. The prints were spaced like a human's but deeper and wider. I shrugged it off, telling myself it might be from a hunter or a park ranger, and kept moving. An hour later, the trail became even less clear, and the sun was starting to lower in the sky. I realized I might have missed a fork. The forest here was denser, with trees close together and thick underbrush. I pulled out the map again, but the details were hard to read in the dim light. I decided to take a break and figure out where I was. That's when I noticed a noise behind me, a sharp snap of a twig. I froze and listened. The forest was quiet again, but that crack had been distinct, close. My heart sped up. I turned slowly, scanning the trees but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or a bird, but the uneasy feeling stayed. I packed my bag and started walking faster back toward what I thought was the direction of the trailhead. The sun was almost down by the time I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the creek near my camp. I paused and looked down. Everything looked unfamiliar. The creek curved differently, and I realized I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I was lost. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to calm myself, breathing slowly, thinking of the basics: stay calm, find the trail, and don't wander off. I pulled out my phone. No signal. The forest swallowed the reception like a wall. I knew I couldn't stay here all night, so I decided to try and find my way back by following the creek downstream, hoping it would lead to the camp or a road. I walked along the water's edge, the ground slippery and uneven. The shadows were growing longer, and the forest darkened quickly. Suddenly, I heard another twig snap, this time behind me and much closer. I stopped dead. My eyes darted, trying to pierce the dimming forest. I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure maybe, but it disappeared behind a tree. My heart pounded harder. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the way it moved was deliberate, not like any animal I had seen. I picked up my pace, the dry leaves crunching loudly under my boots. The night was coming fast. The forest was no longer welcoming but ominous. I realized I hadn't brought my flashlight on the hike, a stupid oversight I cursed myself for. I wished I had stayed at camp. The creek curved sharply, and I saw the first sign of a trail, faint tire tracks and a broken branch that looked like someone had passed recently. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. The tire tracks led me to an old logging road. The gravel was rough, and the forest on both sides was thick and dark. Relief washed over me. I was no longer completely lost. I walked along the logging road for what felt like miles. The moon was rising, casting pale light through the trees, but I still felt watched. Then I saw a campfire glow through the trees ahead. I moved closer but stayed hidden behind a bush. The fire was small, and beside it were some empty cans and a sleeping bag. The place looked recently used but abandoned. That's when I heard voices, low and muffled, hard to make out from this distance. I stayed back, not wanting to reveal myself. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the firelight. A man, tall and broad, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. He looked around, then sat down, pulling a knife from his belt. I backed away quietly, heart racing. Something about him felt wrong. I didn't want to get caught or seen. I turned and started running back down the road, faster than before. My breath came out ragged and loud in the cold air. Branches grabbed at my jacket, and my feet slipped on loose rocks. I didn't stop running until I was sure the fire and voices were far behind. I kept going, desperate to get back to my camp. Eventually, I found the trail again, the well-marked one I had missed before. I followed it, the moonlight now full and bright, lighting the path clearly. I ran all the way back to my camp, arriving exhausted but safe. The fire I had left burning was just a faint pile of embers, but it was still warm. I collapsed inside my tent, locking the zipper tightly. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside made me jump, but I stayed put until morning. In the daylight, I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to spend another night there. On the hike back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder. I never saw the man again. I told myself it was luck and quick thinking that kept me safe. The woods can be beautiful but also dangerous when you least expect it. I learned that being prepared means more than just bringing gear. It means knowing your limits and respecting the unknown. That trip changed how I see the wilderness, not as an escape, but as a place that demands respect and caution. It was October 2019 when I finally decided to take a break from everything. I just turned 34. My job at a construction firm in Cincinnati had been eating up every part of my day for months. Long hours, constant travel, always on call. I hadn't really slept properly in weeks. My back ached from standing too long. My head was always full of noise. I needed silence. No phones, no city, no one around. Just stillness. So I rented a cabin. Nothing fancy. Just a single-bedroom wooden place about 40 minutes outside of Roanoke, Virginia, tucked into the edge of Jefferson National Forest. The listing said it had been used mostly by hunters in the off-season, so it wasn't updated or stylish. I didn't care. I wanted something old, quiet, with no Wi-Fi. The fewer distractions, the better. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, packed light. I had a few days' worth of food, some instant coffee, and my hiking boots. I brought a portable battery for emergencies, a flashlight, and a small hatchet. I planned to just sit there, maybe walk in the woods, clear my head, and sleep in. When I got to the cabin, it was exactly what I wanted. It sat back from the road, off a small gravel trail that looked like it hadn't been used much. The trees around it were tall and thick. The leaves had turned already, mostly gold and deep red, and the whole forest floor looked like it had a fire-colored carpet laid over it. The cabin itself was maybe 25 feet wide, built from rough logs, with a tin roof and a tiny porch with a single wooden chair. No neighbors, no signs of other cabins, just trees and silence. Inside, the air smelled faintly like old pine and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a small wood stove in the corner with a pile of chopped logs beside it, a cot with a thin mattress, and an old table with two mismatched chairs. The windows were small and had no screens. I checked the cupboards. A few old cans, mostly empty. A mouse had chewed through one box of crackers. I threw it out. There was no running water, only a hand pump out back. The outhouse was about 20 feet into the trees, leaning a little but solid. I settled in quickly. I didn't plan to do much anyway. That first night, I just unpacked, made a fire in the stove, and ate some crackers and canned chili. I remember how quiet it was. Not just the absence of noise, but a kind of stillness that made you notice things you usually ignore, like the sound of the wind brushing against dry leaves, or a branch cracking somewhere far off. It wasn't creepy, not yet. It was peaceful. I sat outside for a while after dark, just staring up through the branches at the stars. It was the next morning that I noticed something odd. I woke up at around 7. I'd left the stove burning low through the night, just to keep the chill off. I stepped outside to use the outhouse and take a piss, and I noticed prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I'd worn boots with a deep tread. These were flat, shallow prints, like sneakers or soft-soled shoes, and they weren't fresh, maybe made the evening before or earlier that morning. But they were there. I could see the shape of the heel, even a faint toe line in the soft dirt by the porch. They circled around the cabin. One set went up to the side window, then turned back. Another set came up from the woods behind the outhouse. I stood there for a while, just staring at the ground. There wasn't any sign of dragging or damage, and the door was still locked from the inside. I told myself it was probably nothing. Could have been an old trail. Could have been mine from the night before and I just didn't remember. But I knew that wasn't right. I kept thinking about it all morning. I made some instant coffee, sat outside on the porch and tried to shake it off. But I couldn't. It was too strange. Who would walk around out here? There were no other cabins nearby. The gravel road was a dead end. I decided to walk the perimeter just to see. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet, mostly for comfort, and went about 100 feet into the woods in each direction. I didn't see any fresh campsites, no trash, no signs of anyone, just trees. By mid-afternoon, I was back at the cabin. I closed the shutters on the side windows and made sure the door was locked. I checked it twice. That night, I kept the fire going a little higher than before. I sat in bed with my flashlight close by, listening. The wind picked up around 10. The leaves scraped against the window panes, and I thought I heard something walking outside around 11, but it might have just been a raccoon. At one point, just before midnight, I got up and looked through the window. I didn't see anything, Just the edge of the woods, dark and silent. I tried to sleep, but only drifted off sometime after one. When I woke up, the first thing I did was go outside and check the ground. There were more prints. These were fresher. The tread was clearer, more defined. They were closer to the front door now, and one set had gone around the side to the back window again. Something about the way the prints moved made my stomach turn. It wasn't just someone passing through. It looked like someone was checking the place out, circling it, watching. I didn't eat breakfast. I felt sick. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to Cincinnati. But I felt like if I left now, without knowing who had been out there, it would stay in my head forever. I needed to be sure, so I made a plan. That afternoon, I cleared out a spot in the firewood pile near the porch and tucked my phone, with the flashlight camera on, behind one of the logs, facing the cabin. I angled it low, pointing toward the path that led from the woods to the side window. I pressed record and left it running. I had the battery pack hooked up so it would last at least 12 hours. Then I waited. I didn't light the stove that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I stayed quiet in the dark, crouched behind the edge of the cot with my flashlight off. I left the window cracked just enough to hear better. Hours passed. It was almost 2 a.m. when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate ones. Not an animal. Not the wind. The sound of soft shoes pressing down on dry leaves and loose dirt. They came from the trees, then moved to the porch. I held my breath. The floorboard creaked. One loud pop. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't dare. My hand was around the handle of the hatchet, but my fingers were wet with sweat. I was waiting for a knock, a bang, something, but nothing happened. After what felt like an hour, the sound moved again. The steps circled the cabin. I could hear them brushing against the wall just outside. Then nothing. I stayed still until morning. As soon as the light came through the cracks in the shutter, I stood and grabbed my phone from the pile. My hand shook as I stopped the recording. I watched the footage. At exactly 1:56 a.m., a figure stepped into frame. Male, maybe late 30s, tall, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He didn't look toward the camera. He walked up to the porch, paused, and leaned against the post like he was listening. Then he walked slowly around the side of the cabin, out of view. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. Just stood there, then left. I packed my things right then. I stuffed everything into the duffel, didn't even fold the blanket. I just threw it in. I didn't eat, didn't shower. I left the cabin exactly as it was and got in my car. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I looked back once. Nothing behind me, but that didn't matter. I drove back to the main road and didn't stop until I hit the first gas station 2 towns away. There, I sat in the lot and played the video again. The part that hit me hardest wasn't the man standing there. It was that, earlier in the video, around 11:13 p.m., I saw a faint flicker of light in the background, between the trees, like a flashlight moving deeper into the woods, which meant the guy I saw wasn't alone. Someone else had been there too, watching from farther away. I went to the local sheriff's office. I showed them the footage. They took my statement, but I could tell they weren't surprised. The deputy said sometimes squatters or vagrants pass through those woods. Sometimes, people use the forest for things they don't want others to see. They sent someone to check the cabin out later that day. I never heard if they found anything. I never went back. I didn't sleep properly for weeks after that. I kept thinking about how long they might have been watching. Whether they'd been there the first night too, standing just out of view, watching through the window, and the way he walked up to the porch like he already knew I was inside. Now, years later, I still remember the way the dirt looked that second morning. The prints all facing the windows, all facing me. I thought I was going to that cabin to get away from people, but people were exactly what I should have been afraid of. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 27 years old when I decided to take a break from my usual life in the city and head into the wilderness for some solitude. I found a small cabin to rent in the remote forests of northern Minnesota, near a tiny town called Willow Creek. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far from any neighbors or roads. The only way to get there was by a rough dirt trail that twisted through thick pine trees and patches of wild blueberry bushes. The idea was to spend a full 2 weeks alone, away from work, phones, and people, just me and the silence of the forest. I had been working non-stop for months at a small software company in Minneapolis, stuck in front of a computer all day, and the stress was getting to me. The city noise, the crowded subway, the endless meetings, it all felt suffocating. I needed to breathe, to clear my head, and to find something real. I wanted to be away from everything for a while, just living simply, cooking over a fire, reading and hiking. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Built in the early 1960s, it was a single-story wooden structure with faded green paint peeling off the walls. It sat beside a small lake called Mirror Lake, named so because the water was usually so still it reflected the sky perfectly. The cabin had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a propane stove, a tiny bathroom with a hand pump for water, and a loft with a bed. There was no electricity, no running water except for the lake and a hand pump well outside. It was basic, but it had everything I needed. The first day I arrived, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with unease. I parked my old blue Toyota near the trailhead and hauled my backpack and a heavy cooler filled with food down the path to the cabin. The forest was thick with tall spruce and pine trees. The air smelled like earth and resin, and the ground was soft with pine needles. Birds chirped overhead, and I spotted a couple of squirrels darting between the branches. When I reached the cabin, I set down my gear and took a long look around. The lake stretched out in front of me, calm and clear, surrounded by the dense forest. There were no sounds of cars or planes, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a loon somewhere far away. I opened the cabin door, and the smell of old wood mixed with faint mildew hit me. Dust particles floated in the sunlight coming through the windows. Inside, the cabin was cold and quiet. I went straight to the fireplace and stacked some dry logs from a nearby pile. I lit a fire and watched the flames crackle and pop, feeling a little better already. I unpacked my food, mostly canned beans, rice, dried fruit, and some fresh vegetables I bought from the last town I passed through. I boiled water on the stove for coffee and settled down in a wooden chair by the window. That first night, I lay in the loft bed under a thick wool blanket. The silence was intense. Without city noise to mask the sounds, every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood, and every bird call felt amplified. At times, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, but when I looked, there was nothing but shadows cast by moonlight filtering through the trees. The next morning, I woke early and went to the lake. The water was icy cold when I dipped my hands in, but refreshing. I rinsed my face and drank some fresh water from the well pump outside. The day was clear and warm, with a gentle breeze moving the tops of the trees. I spent the day hiking along the shore, finding wild berries, and marking trails on a map I brought. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I woke with the sun, cooked simple meals over the fire, read old paperbacks I brought, and spent hours walking through the woods or sitting by the lake. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The forest was alive in its quiet way. Birds built nests, insects buzzed, and the wind whispered through the branches. But as the days went on, I began to notice small things that unsettled me. The first was the footprints. One morning after a rainstorm, I saw strange footprints in the mud near the lake shore. Not mine. They looked like boots but older, worn down, as if someone had walked there recently. The prints led from the trees to the water and then disappeared. I checked my map, trying to figure out if there were any other cabins or houses nearby. According to the map, no one else was supposed to be close. The nearest town was miles away, and no trails led directly here except the one I came down. Still, I felt like I wasn't alone. The next evening, I was sitting by the fire when I heard a branch snap not far from the cabin. My heart jumped, and I sat very still, listening. There was a faint rustling in the bushes, then silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I started to notice odd things inside the cabin too. One morning, my coffee cup was in a different spot than I remembered leaving it. A small tool I had put on the table was missing for a few hours and then found on the floor. Nothing seemed to be damaged or broken, just little signs that someone or something had been moving around when I wasn't paying attention. By the 6th day, I felt nervous enough to keep a large kitchen knife close to me at all times. I also started locking the cabin door, even though I didn't know who I was locking out. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help or check messages. I thought about leaving, but a part of me was stubborn. I wanted to prove I could handle this alone. On the 7th day, the unease grew. I woke before dawn and noticed fresh footprints in the soft ground near the cabin's back door. They were bigger than mine, and they led into the woods, then stopped abruptly. I spent the day watching the edge of the forest from the cabin window, but I didn't see anyone. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned and rattled in the darkness. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang against the cabin wall. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wood. I froze, listening. Silence. I grabbed the knife and moved cautiously toward the door, trying to keep quiet. Outside, the forest was pitch black except for a faint glow from the stars. I looked around but saw nothing. The smell of damp earth and pine was thick. I stayed by the door for a long time, waiting, but no more sounds came. Eventually, I went back to bed but couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. The next day, I found fresh footprints again. This time, they led to the lake's edge and then followed the shoreline, disappearing into the trees on the other side. I tried not to panic, but my hands shook as I gathered my things. I made a decision to leave the cabin the following morning. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire low and the knife within reach. Around midnight, I heard movement outside, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall opposite the door and tried to control my breathing. The steps stopped suddenly, then a faint scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. Then silence again. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the pale light spread through the trees. When the sun finally rose, I packed everything quickly, double-checked the locks, and headed back down the trail to my car. The forest felt colder and less welcoming as I walked away. When I reached the trailhead, I locked the car doors and sat inside, breathing heavily. Back in the city, the feeling of safety returned slowly. I told myself it was probably a local hunter or a camper who didn't mean any harm. Maybe they were curious or lost. There were reports of strange men lurking around cabins in the area, but nothing ever proven. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, at night, when the city noise fades, I think about those footsteps in the mud and the eyes I never saw but felt watching me. And I remember that in the quiet woods, far from everything, you aren't always alone. And sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't see. I went camping alone in the summer of 2017, up near a quiet stretch of woods just outside of Glidden, Wisconsin. I was 27 back then, living in Eau Claire, working full-time at a small roofing company. I didn't get much time off, but I had managed to block out a 4-day weekend and decided I'd use it to unwind. I didn't want to go anywhere crowded or commercial, just a quiet place in nature where I could breathe. I didn't want to deal with anyone. I didn't even tell my coworkers or friends exactly where I'd be. I just said I was heading north, which I thought was enough. I had done a lot of hiking and camping before, so I figured I'd be fine. I picked a spot I'd read about in an old hiking forum, a little clearing about 3 miles off a decommissioned logging road. It didn't have a name. I found it by cross-referencing a bunch of maps and satellite images. It was surrounded by thick woods, bordered by a stream on one side and some small rocky hills on the other. The kind of place that never sees more than a couple of people a year. That's what I wanted, solitude. I parked my truck at the end of the logging road, tossed my backpack over my shoulder, and started the hike in. The first half-mile was pretty easy, an old, overgrown trail. After that, it was more of a bushwhack. I had a handheld GPS, a paper map, and a compass, and I took my time. I got to the clearing in the late afternoon. It was just like the forum post had said, peaceful, quiet, and flat enough for a tent. There were no signs of recent visitors, no footprints, no trash, no cut branches. Just me and the woods. I set up my tent under a cluster of pines, about 20 yards from the stream. The ground was soft and covered in pine needles. I cooked some instant rice and tuna on my little camp stove, ate while sitting on a log, and watched the sky turn orange through the trees. I felt completely at peace. The air was cool, the bugs weren't too bad, and the sound of the stream was calming. That night, I slept hard. The next morning, I got up early and walked upstream for a few hours. I found a nice flat rock and just sat there, listening to the water. I saw a few deer in the distance, heard a woodpecker, and even spotted a fox darting between some fallen trees. It felt like the kind of day I'd remember forever. I came back to camp around midday, made some coffee, and took a short nap in my tent with the flap open. When I woke up, something felt off. Nothing specific, just this subtle tension in the air. I tried to shake it off. I made myself walk down to the stream, splash some water on my face, and forced myself to enjoy the moment. I told myself I was just tired, maybe a little dehydrated, but as I walked back to camp, I noticed something small and strange. My folding knife was open and sticking in the ground near the fire pit. I hadn't left it like that. I remember standing there for a full minute, just staring at it. I always kept it closed and clipped to my pack. I wasn't sure if maybe I'd used it earlier and forgotten, but that didn't feel right. I checked my bag, it was unzipped. Everything was still inside, but the zipper was open halfway down. I tried to tell myself I must have left it like that, but I knew I didn't. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every sound outside the tent had me sitting up and holding my breath. The wind in the trees sounded like whispers. Once or twice I thought I heard footsteps, but they were too faint to be sure. I finally dozed off around 3 a.m., clutching the knife in my hand inside the sleeping bag. When I woke up the next morning, the flap of my tent was wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I know that for a fact. I had zipped it shut from the inside. My boots were sitting outside, side by side, but turned around, like someone had taken them off and placed them backward. That did not happen by accident. I packed up fast. I didn't cook breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, grabbed my water bottle, and took off down the same path I came in on. My heart was racing. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves had me spinning around. I kept thinking I'd see someone following me, but I never did. I got back to my truck by early afternoon. The gravel near the wheels was disturbed more than I remembered. A few pine needles had been caught under the windshield wipers. My gut was screaming that someone had been there while I was gone. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove out of there without stopping once. I should have gone home, but I didn't. I drove into Glidden and booked a cheap room at a rundown roadside motel. I needed to be around people. I took the longest shower I've ever taken and sat on the bed for hours, just trying to sort through everything. I didn't feel right. Not sick exactly, just off, like I'd been watched for days. That night, I kept the lights on and barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard a soft knock on the door. Just once. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited for it to happen again. Didn't. I stayed up until the sun came up. When I left that motel the next morning, I drove straight to a sporting goods store and bought a trail cam. I drove all the way back to the edge of the logging road. I couldn't bring myself to hike back in, but I left the camera on a tree near where I'd parked the first time. I angled it toward the trailhead and set it to record motion-triggered clips. 2 weeks later, I drove back up to get it. The camera was still there. It hadn't been touched. I took it home and went through the footage. Most of it was just squirrels, birds, and branches swaying in the wind. But there was one clip that made my stomach turn cold. It was from the third night I'd been out there. Around 1:47 a.m., a man walked past the camera. He wasn't carrying a flashlight. He moved slow, quiet. He wore dark clothes, baggy enough to hide his shape, and a hood pulled over his head. He walked with a limp. He never looked at the camera, just walked across the frame, then vanished into the woods. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like an hour. I called the county sheriff's office. I didn't know what I expected them to do. They said they'd look into it, but didn't sound too concerned. said it was probably some hunter or local who wandered through. But that didn't explain my knife, or the open tent, or the way my boots had been turned around, or the knock at the motel. I didn't go camping again that year, or the year after that. I sold my tent, stove, and most of my gear. I started checking the locks on my doors 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a night. For a while, I thought I saw that same man in crowds or across the street. Just quick flashes of someone who looked similar. It always turned out to be someone else, but it messed with my head. That took me almost 3 years to go out again. And when I did, I didn't go alone. I went with 2 friends, both armed, and we stayed in a public campsite with other people around. I still don't like sleeping outside. Not really. I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. Whatever happened out there in those woods, it wasn't a bear or a trick of the mind. It was someone who had been watching me, someone who waited until I fell asleep, someone who got close enough to unzip my tent and stand over me. And the scariest part is that they didn't take anything. They didn't hurt me. They didn't leave a note or make a noise. They just let me know they were there. I went camping alone in late October of 2019. I was 32 at the time, living in a small apartment in Springfield, Missouri. I worked remotely doing IT for a logistics company, so I had a flexible schedule. Things had been stressful that fall. My father passed away in August, and I had just gone through a breakup a few weeks later. I needed time away from everything, and being out in the woods had always helped me reset. I picked a spot in the Mark Twain National Forest, about 2.5 hours south of where I lived. It was a quiet place. Massive forest, small gravel roads, not many marked trails in the area I was heading. I found it a few years earlier while exploring on my own. There was a clearing next to a little creek that always stayed shallow, with soft mossy ground and a few fallen logs to sit on. I had camped there 3 times before and never saw another person in the area. No cell signal out there either, which was what I wanted. I loaded my SUV with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, some canned food, water jugs, flashlight, firewood, small hatchet, and a new hunting knife I bought the week before. I also packed extra batteries, some thick clothes, and a paperback book. I had a weather app saved offline, and it showed the weekend would be clear but cold, dropping into the 30s at night. That didn't bother me. I liked the cold. What I didn't like was people, at least not right then. I left early on a Friday morning and got to the forest around 9:30. The sky was clear and the air crisp. I rolled down the windows as I drove the last stretch on a dirt road, letting in the smell of fallen leaves and pine. Once I got to the familiar turnoff, I put the car in 4-wheel drive and eased through the trees until I reached the clearing. It looked exactly how I remembered it. Quiet, a little damp, shaded by tall oaks and sycamores. The creek made its usual soft bubbling sound nearby. I didn't see any trash or tire marks, so it didn't seem like anyone else had been there recently. I parked under a big tree near the edge of the clearing and took my time setting up camp. I staked the tent near the creek, made sure it was taut and waterproofed, then set up my sleeping area inside with a thick mat and my 0-degree sleeping bag. I stacked some firewood in a dry spot, laid out my camp stove on a flat rock, and dug a small latrine behind a group of bushes. Everything was routine. I wasn't in a hurry. I had 3 full days to do nothing. The first day went exactly how I hoped. I made a late breakfast and read a few chapters of my book. I walked upstream for a while, saw some deer tracks and one old coyote den. I brought a compass and map with me just to be careful, but I never got more than a mile from camp. The forest was dense but calm, with occasional rustling from squirrels or birds. I saw no signs of other people, no wrappers, no old fire pits, no boot prints. That evening I made a fire and ate canned chili with crackers. I sat by the flames for hours, sipping hot coffee and staring at the trees. As the sky darkened, the temperature dropped fast, so I put on a wool hat and thicker jacket. I heard an owl call out a few times, and once, something small ran through the leaves not far off, probably a rabbit or raccoon. Nothing unusual. I went to bed early that night, around 9:30. The tent was zip tight, and I had a small lantern hanging from the inside top. I read a few more pages and turned it off. The sounds of the forest lulled me. Wind in the branches, the creek bubbling nearby. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next day started normal but didn't stay that way. I woke around 7:30, cold but rested. There was a thin layer of frost on the tent, and my breath fogged in the air. I boiled water for instant oatmeal and made more coffee. As I was eating, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. Broken twigs, maybe a faint trail in the leaves leading deeper into the woods, opposite the creek. I assumed it was just from a deer or something passing through, but I didn't remember seeing it the day before. I walked over and took a closer look. The twigs were snapped clean, and there were marks in the dirt, too big for a deer. They looked like footprints, but not clear enough to be sure. I brushed it off. Could have been from me walking around yesterday. Still, something about it bugged me. I decided to hike a different direction that day, heading west along the creek. The air was brisk and quiet. I followed animal trails and kept an eye on my compass. Around noon, I found an old tree stand high up in a sycamore, long abandoned. I climbed partway up to look around. The forest stretched on in every direction. No roads, no clearings, no signs of people. I liked that. I stayed out for a few hours, then turned back. When I got back to camp, the air felt different. Still quiet, but heavier somehow. I checked everything. Tent was fine, gear was untouched, nothing moved. But I noticed more snapped branches in the same direction as before, and now I was sure there were prints in the leaves, boot prints. Not mine. The sole pattern was different and the stride was longer. They were faint but fresh. They came from the woods, circled halfway around my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. That made my stomach drop. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe someone had wandered through, maybe a hunter passing by, but they didn't call out. They didn't leave a note. They didn't come to say hi, which was strange for how close they got to the tent. And I hadn't heard a thing. I kept scanning the woods. Nothing moved. The sun was still a few hours from setting. I took a slow walk around the clearing, looking for more signs. I found another partial print near the creek, and some leaves disturbed on the other side of the campsite. Whoever it was had been quiet, careful. I started to feel watched. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake it. I kept checking behind me. I took out my knife and kept it on my belt. I didn't pack a gun. That was a mistake. I didn't cook dinner that night. I ate a protein bar and some jerky, then packed up all the loose gear and tied my food bag high in a tree. I doused the fire completely and double-checked the tent zippers. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to draw attention. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. I laid in the sleeping bag fully clothed, knife in hand, listening. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I heard something. It started as light footsteps. Not animals, not four-legged, soft but deliberate, moving slowly outside the tent, leaves crunching under weight. I held my breath. The steps stopped for a long time, then started again, moving to the back of the tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. There was a long pause. Then I heard breathing. It was faint but real, right outside the tent, deep and steady. Someone was standing inches from the wall of fabric between us. I gripped the knife tight, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. The breathing continued, slow and steady. Then it stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle tense. After what felt like an hour, I heard the leaves crunch again, this time moving away, step by step. Eventually, it faded into the forest. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. No prints, no marks. The forest looked peaceful, but I knew what I heard. Someone had been there, standing over me in the dark, not trying to break in, not trying to talk, just watching. I packed up in 15 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I shoved everything into the SUV and got out as fast as I could. I checked the rearview mirror the entire drive back to the main road. I didn't see anyone. I reported it to the rangers when I got back to town. They took my statement but said they didn't have enough to go on. No injuries, no theft, no proof of anything illegal, just a scary experience. They said it could have been a lost hiker, a drifter, maybe a hunter who got too close without realizing. But I knew better. Whoever that was, they knew I was there. They circled my tent. They stood outside it in the dead of night. That wasn't someone lost. That was someone waiting. I never went back to that spot. It took me months to camp again, and when I finally did, it was in a marked campground with other people nearby. I started bringing a pistol with me after that. People think the woods are scary because of animals or ghosts or getting lost. But what really stays with you is knowing someone was out there, watching you in the dark, without a sound, without a word, just standing there, and knowing they chose to leave, for now. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into one of the most tense, unsettling experiences of my life. I'm Jake, 34 years old, and I live in northern Vermont, a place known for its thick forests and quiet, peaceful lakes. It was early October 2017, and the trees were turning their fiery colors. Deep reds, bright yellows, and burnt oranges. I had been craving some time alone, away from the noise of the city and the constant buzzing of work emails and phone calls. So I rented a small cabin near Lake Moreau, a spot I'd never been to before but had heard was perfect for some solitude. The cabin was nothing fancy. It was an old wooden structure, probably built in the 1950s, with peeling paint on the outside and a small porch that overlooked the lake. The place came with a basic kitchen, a wood stove for heat, and a single bedroom. There was no internet, no cell reception, which was exactly what I wanted, no distractions, no one to bother me. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, carrying my backpack, a few groceries, and a stack of books. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I unlocked the cabin door, and the creak of the hinges sounded louder than I expected in the quiet. Inside, the wooden floor was cold under my feet, and the faint smell of old wood and dust filled the room. I pulled back the curtains to see the lake just a few steps from the porch, its surface calm and reflective like glass. That first evening, I chopped some firewood, stacked it carefully by the stove, and started a small fire to warm the room. I cooked a simple meal on the tiny stove, sat down in a creaky old chair by the fire, and read for a few hours. The silence was both peaceful and a little unsettling. So quiet I could hear my own breathing and the occasional crackle of the fire. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in a thick wool sweater and sat close to the stove. Outside, the forest was pitch black, and the moon was just a thin sliver in the sky. I didn't hear any animals at first, just the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. But as the night deepened, strange noises started to filter in. It wasn't howls or anything wild, but subtle sounds, branches snapping, something heavy brushing against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, maybe a raccoon trying to get at the trash I'd left outside. Still, the sounds made me tense. I stayed awake longer than I wanted, poking the fire to keep it alive, scanning the dark windows for movement. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep, though the noises kept me restless. The next morning, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. The forest was dense with tall pines and oaks. The ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps. I wandered for a couple of hours, taking in the colors and the smell of damp moss and wet earth. I didn't see any other people, just birds flitting through the branches and the occasional squirrel darting across the path. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. On the porch steps, there were fresh footprints, barely visible but definitely human. They were small, like a woman's or child's shoes, but there was no sign of anyone around. I checked the door locks. Everything was still secure. I told myself it was probably an animal or maybe a hiker who'd passed by while I was out. Still, it left a knot in my stomach. That evening, the strange noises returned. This time, they felt closer, more deliberate. Something was moving around the cabin, heavy footsteps pacing back and forth. I could hear scraping sounds, like someone dragging their shoes on the porch boards. I stayed still by the window, watching into the blackness, waiting for a figure to emerge, but there was nothing but shadows. I kept the fire going late into the night, my heart pounding. I didn't want to call anyone. There was no cell signal, and I was supposed to be alone here. The idea of an intruder was terrifying, but I rationalized that if anyone was out here, they probably meant no harm. Maybe a local who lost their way. The next day, I found something else that unsettled me even more. On the cabin floor, near the back door, I noticed a small, smooth stone. It wasn't there the day before. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand. It looked like a river stone, rounded and worn. Not something you'd normally find just lying on a wooden floor in a cabin. I set it down on the kitchen table and looked around for any other signs that someone had been inside. The back door was locked, windows shut tight. No furniture was moved, no food missing, no signs of forced entry. But the stone wasn't mine. Whoever had left it here had been inside. From then on, the nights grew worse. The noises outside the cabin increased. More footsteps, more scraping, even the sound of heavy breathing sometimes. I never saw anyone, but I felt eyes on me whenever I was outside or sitting by the window. The feeling of being watched gnawed at me relentlessly. I stopped exploring the forest. I didn't leave the cabin after dark anymore, and even during the day I kept the windows closed. I started locking every door and window, double-checking them obsessively. I also piled wood against the back door, hoping it would discourage anyone from trying to break in. On the third night, I found a message scratched into the wood of the porch railing. It was faint, probably done with a sharp stone or nail. The letters were crude but readable. "Go away." My heart slammed in my chest. Whoever had been here wasn't just wandering or lost. They wanted me gone, and they were close enough to leave that message. I felt trapped, isolated, and scared like never before. I stayed inside, pacing, thinking about what to do. There was no cell service, no neighbors nearby. The cabin was miles from the nearest town. I debated trying to hike out through the forest the next morning, but I was also stubborn. I told myself I could wait out the weekend, that maybe this was just some local prank or kids messing around. Still, the fear was real. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that froze me in place. A soft thud on the roof. Then another, and another. Someone was walking on the cabin roof. I gripped the fire poker like a weapon, creeping to the front door. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. I looked up and saw a dark silhouette moving slowly above me, stepping carefully between the wooden beams. The sound stopped suddenly, and the roof went silent again. I pressed myself against the door, trying to calm my shaking hands. I knew I couldn't stay here one more night. The first light, I packed quickly. I grabbed my backpack, leaving most of my things behind. I made sure the fire was out and locked every door and window before stepping out onto the porch. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale orange light over the lake. I started walking down the narrow dirt road that led away from the cabin. The forest was quiet except for birdsong and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I walked for what felt like hours, the cabin growing smaller behind me. Eventually, I reached a small ranger station. I was relieved to see a few cars parked outside and people moving around. I explained what had happened as best as I could, though I left out how scared I was of being watched, how someone had clearly been inside the cabin, and how I heard footsteps on the roof. The ranger took notes and promised to check the cabin. Later that week, I learned the truth. The cabin had been broken into before by a man who had been living in the woods nearby, a drifter who had been hiding out there for months. He wasn't dangerous in a violent way, but he was disturbed, territorial, and very private. When I rented the cabin, the owner hadn't told me the full story or the warnings the local rangers had about the man. The footprints, the noises, and the messages were all from him trying to scare off anyone who came near his hiding spot. I never went back to that cabin. The experience changed how I thought about solitude and safety. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but real people with real problems, and being alone in the wild means you have to be prepared for all kinds of dangers, not just the natural ones. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the woods of northern Maine. I was 27 at the time, tired of the noise and stress of city life in Boston, and I wanted to escape for a few days into the quiet. I had some experience camping with friends but never alone, so I thought this would be a good test of my skills and patience. I didn't want anything fancy, just me, a tent, a backpack, and the wilderness. I planned my trip for mid-July, hoping the weather would be warm but not too hot. I packed my gear carefully: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for cool nights, a small stove, enough food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a map of the area, and a compass. I also brought a flashlight, extra batteries, and a multi-tool. I left my phone in airplane mode to save battery but kept it in case of emergencies. The trailhead was about a 3-hour drive from my apartment. I woke up early, grabbed some coffee, and loaded my car. The highway gave way to winding roads lined with tall pine trees and wild blueberry bushes. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine needles, earth, and something faintly sweet. When I arrived at the small parking lot, there were only a few cars, so I knew I'd have plenty of space. I double-checked my backpack, slung it on my back, and set off down the trail. The path was narrow and muddy from a recent rainstorm. I could hear birds chirping and the distant rush of a river. The forest was thick, with towering trees stretching skyward, their branches weaving together to block much of the sunlight. I kept my pace steady, taking in the quiet except for the occasional rustle of small animals. After about 2 miles, I found a clearing beside a slow-moving stream that looked perfect for my campsite. The ground was flat and dry, with a few large rocks and fallen logs nearby. I set my backpack down and started unpacking. Pitching the tent took some time because the poles had a tricky way of snapping together, but eventually it stood firm. I collected some dry wood and kindling from the edges of the clearing, careful not to disturb any green plants. Starting the fire was a slow process. My matches were damp from sweat, and the wood was stubborn. After several attempts, the flames finally caught, and the fire crackled warmly. I boiled water over the small stove, then ate some dehydrated meals I had packed. The taste was bland, but filling. As the afternoon slipped away, I explored the nearby woods a little. I followed animal tracks and spotted a few squirrels darting between trees. The sun started dipping low, casting long shadows and painting the sky orange. I returned to the campsite and prepared for nightfall. I cleaned up my area to avoid attracting wildlife, storing food in a sealed container and hanging it from a tree branch with rope. Night was the hardest part. The forest changed completely. Sounds I hadn't noticed during the day became clear. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, twigs snapping somewhere beyond the firelight. I tried to stay calm and focused on my breathing. I reminded myself that these sounds were normal here, part of the life of the forest. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a loud crack from the woods. It sounded like a big branch snapping, maybe a deer or a bear stepping heavily on dry wood. My heart pounded, and I sat up slowly, shining my flashlight toward the noise. I didn't see anything, but the fire was nearly out, so I added more wood and blew gently to revive the flames. I stayed awake for the next few hours, half listening to the forest. I thought about the stories I had heard about campers who had gotten lost or had close calls with wild animals, and I kept reminding myself to stay alert but not scared. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The air was cool and damp with morning mist hanging over the stream. I made coffee on the stove and watched the sun rise slowly behind the trees. The quiet was peaceful, almost holy. I felt a deep connection to this place that I hadn't expected. I spent the day hiking further into the woods, mapping my way with my compass and making notes in a small journal I had brought. On the third day, I started packing up around noon. The thought of returning to the city made me feel a little sad, but also relieved. I wanted to make sure I left no trace of my stay, so I carefully put out the fire, doused the ashes with water, and scattered the remaining wood. I checked my gear to be sure nothing was left behind. As I walked back toward the trailhead, I felt something was off. The forest seemed quieter than before. The usual background sounds of birds and insects were missing. I stopped to listen carefully but heard only the sound of my boots on the dirt. The sky was cloudy, and the light dimmed as if the trees had swallowed the sun. I brushed the feeling aside and kept going, but after about an hour, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. The path didn't look familiar, and my compass needle was swinging erratically. I pulled out the map and compared it to my surroundings, but the dense forest made it hard to identify landmarks. Panic started creeping in. I tried to stay calm and retraced my steps, but soon I was hopelessly lost. The afternoon stretched on, and I walked in circles, hoping to find a trail or some sign of the way back. My water was running low, and my legs ached from the uneven ground. The shadows grew longer and the sky darker. I considered making a shelter for the night, but the thought of spending a second night lost was terrifying. I sat down on a fallen log, took deep breaths, and tried to plan. I had some emergency rations left and a whistle for signaling, but I hadn't told anyone my exact location. My phone had no signal. The sun was setting, and the forest grew colder quickly. I decided to stay put near the log and wait until morning to try again. As night fell, I lit a small fire again with the last dry wood I could find, keeping close to it for warmth and light. The sounds of the forest returned, louder now, and I tried to focus on the fire to keep my mind steady. I heard distant howls that I guessed were coyotes, but they stayed far away. Morning came slowly. I was cold and exhausted, but I felt stronger after the night. I drank some water, ate my last bit of food, and planned a new route. I followed the sun's position and tried to move downhill, hoping it would lead me to the stream and then to the trail. After a few hours, I heard the faint sound of running water. My heart leapt. I rushed toward it and found the stream from my campsite. Relief flooded over me. From there, I remembered the trailhead was just upstream. I followed the water, careful not to slip on wet rocks. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the familiar clearing and parked cars in the distance. I broke into a run, feeling tears sting my eyes from exhaustion and relief. When I reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. That trip taught me a lot about respect for nature and preparation. I realized how easily things could go wrong, even with some experience and gear. The forest is beautiful but unforgiving. I never took the wilderness for granted again. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to take a break from the city and go spend a week alone at a cabin in northern Vermont. I was 29 years old, working a desk job that left me feeling drained and disconnected from the world. I'd never been much of a nature person, but the thought of quiet woods, the smell of pine, and the cool, crisp air sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin itself was owned by a small rental company, tucked away near a lake not far from a tiny town called Lyndonville. The drive up from Boston was long, nearly 4 hours, but I didn't mind. I left early in the morning, and as I drove further north, the traffic thinned out and the landscape changed. The rolling hills gave way to dense forests, and the road wound sharply through groves of tall, straight pine trees. The sky was clear, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating patches of light and shadow on the pavement. It felt peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. I arrived just after noon. The cabin was small but sturdy, built of dark brown logs with a green metal roof. It sat on a gentle slope that led down to a narrow, quiet lake. A small wooden dock extended a few feet into the water. There was a stone fire pit near the cabin and a stack of firewood neatly piled beside the porch steps. The place looked well kept, but quiet, almost too quiet. The first thing I did was haul my bags inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and a faint scent of pine cleaner. Inside, the floor was made of rough hardwood, and the walls were lined with logs that showed knots and natural cracks. A simple stone fireplace dominated one corner of the main room, with a small pile of firewood stacked nearby. There was a worn leather armchair, a small wooden table, and a modest kitchen area with a stove, fridge, and sink. The cabin had basic electricity and running water, but no internet or cell signal, which was exactly what I wanted. I set my things down, made a quick sandwich, and then stepped out onto the porch. The air was chilly but fresh. I took a deep breath and looked around. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches whispering softly. Across the lake, I could see the fading outline of hills under the blue sky. A few birds chirped somewhere in the distance. It was quiet, almost too quiet. After eating, I decided to explore the area. I followed a narrow dirt path that wound into the woods. The forest was thick with pine, birch, and maple trees, their leaves turning brilliant shades of red, orange, and yellow. The ground was covered in a crunchy carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. I walked for about an hour, enjoying the solitude and the sound of my boots against the earth. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I turned back toward the cabin. The light was softer now, golden and fading fast. I started a fire in the stone pit outside, the flames crackling and glowing warmly. I cooked some simple food over the fire. A can of chili warmed in a small pot, and ate while watching the stars slowly appear above the trees. That first night, I slept well. The cabin was quiet, but the natural sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, distant hoots of owls, and the occasional splash of something moving in the lake were comforting. I felt a strange peace that I hadn't known for a long time. The next day was much the same. I spent the morning chopping wood, gathering more firewood from a small pile near the woodshed. The air was crisp, and the sun was warm on my back. I made a small campfire breakfast of eggs and toast and then went for a longer walk around the lake. I noticed that the water was perfectly still and clear, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. There were a few ducks swimming near the shore, and I saw some deer tracks pressed into the soft earth near the water's edge. The forest was alive in quiet ways, and I felt myself relaxing more with each passing hour. As the afternoon wore on, I went back to the cabin and spent some time reading an old book I had brought along. The cabin's silence was deepening now. The wind picked up slightly, making the branches creak. I heard the far-off sound of a woodpecker hammering a tree trunk. Around sunset, I noticed something odd. When I looked toward the woods across the lake, I thought I saw a flash of movement, a figure, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a trick of the light. The forest could play tricks on the eyes. That evening, I stayed inside longer, lighting the fireplace and sitting in the armchair with a mug of coffee. The fire's glow flickered against the logs, casting shadows on the walls. The windows were dark, reflecting the room back at me. Outside, the wind was rising, and I heard the branches tapping against the cabin. As I was about to get up and close the curtains, I caught sight of something again. A shadow moving quickly between the trees. My heart skipped. I reminded myself the woods were full of animals. Still, a strange unease settled over me. That night, I slept less well. I kept waking up, hearing noises outside. The wind was stronger, rattling the cabin's windows and the porch door. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I looked, there was nothing there. On the third day, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin more carefully. I wanted to be sure no one else was nearby and to reassure myself that I was alone. The morning was chilly and gray, the sky overcast. I walked slowly around the property, noticing small things. The way the trees leaned, the tracks in the mud, the broken branches on the ground. Near the back of the cabin, I found a set of footprints in the soft earth. They were fresh, maybe from the night before. The prints were too big to be animal tracks. They looked like boots. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here had not left when I thought I was alone. I followed the prints carefully, but they disappeared after a few dozen feet, lost in the thick underbrush. The thought that someone might have been close by unsettled me deeply. I went back to the cabin and double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows. I spent the afternoon inside, reading and trying to keep calm. The thought of someone else nearby made me more aware of every sound outside. The wind was still blowing strongly, and the trees groaned and creaked. I heard twigs snapping in the distance. My mind raced with possibilities, but I reminded myself there could be a logical explanation. Maybe another camper, a hunter, or someone from a nearby cabin. By the evening, the sky was clearing again. The stars came out, and the moon cast pale light over the lake. I built a fire in the stone pit and sat near it, watching the flames. I kept the doors locked and the curtains closed. That night was restless again. I woke multiple times to strange noises, soft footsteps in the dirt, something scraping near the porch, the faintest sound of breathing outside the window. I stayed frozen under the blankets, not daring to look. On the fourth day, I thought about leaving. The unease was building, and I didn't want to spend another night alone with those sounds. But I had come all this way, and part of me wanted to prove I wasn't scared. I packed a small backpack with essentials and headed out for a hike through the woods to the north of the cabin. The forest was dense and shadowy, and the trail was rough. I walked for hours, trying to focus on the trees and the mossy ground beneath my feet, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The feeling that I was being watched was constant. When I returned in the late afternoon, the cabin looked the same, quiet and still. I saw no signs of anyone else. But near the back door, I noticed something I hadn't before. A scrap of fabric caught on a bush. It was a small piece of dark cloth, rough and frayed. It didn't belong to me. I brought it inside and looked at it carefully. It was the only real clue that someone else had been close. My mind ran through scenarios. Was it a hunter? A trespasser? Someone dangerous? That night, I decided to stay up late by the fire. I made sure the doors were locked and the windows secured. I sat in the armchair, a heavy metal flashlight in my lap and a large kitchen knife on the table beside me. Around midnight, the wind died down. The forest fell silent except for the occasional call of an owl. Then I heard it, soft footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The cabin door creaked slightly as if someone was testing it. Then silence. I turned on my flashlight and shone it toward the door. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch steps and the empty ground beyond. No one was there. I grabbed the knife and cautiously stepped outside. The porch was empty, except for a few scattered leaves. I looked around but saw no sign of movement. After a tense moment, I locked the door again and went inside. I sat down, hands shaking. The fear was real now, but I forced myself to stay calm. The rest of the night passed slowly. I didn't sleep, just watched the shadows flicker on the walls. When dawn finally came, I felt exhausted but relieved. The next morning, I called the rental company from a nearby town to explain what had happened and to arrange an early checkout. They promised to send someone to check the cabin. That afternoon, It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to escape the noise of the city for a week. I was 27 at the time, working as a junior architect in a small office in Portland, Oregon. The endless hours of drafting and meetings had worn me down, and I needed a break from the constant hum of urban life. I found a listing for a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Oregon, about 2 hours' drive from the city. The pictures showed a rustic wooden cabin nestled among tall pines, with a small lake nearby. It looked perfect, a place where I could breathe fresh air, hike, and clear my head. I packed my car with the essentials: some canned food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, my backpack with clothes, a book, and my camera. I drove out early one Friday morning, taking the winding highway that led through dense forests and small towns. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it became. No more traffic noise, no sirens, no city chatter, just the occasional call of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The cabin was about 5 miles down a gravel road that got narrower and bumpier the further I went. When I finally arrived, the sun was high, filtering through the thick canopy of fir and cedar trees. The cabin was even more charming than the pictures. It was old but well kept, with a small porch and a chimney that looked like it had been used recently. The wood smelled faintly of pine and smoke. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of wood and earth. The main room was simple: a small kitchen area with a sink, an old stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves with canned goods and utensils left behind by the previous renter. There was a couch and a small wood-burning stove in the corner. Upstairs, A narrow staircase led to a loft with a bed and a window that overlooked the forest. I set my things down and opened the windows to let in the fresh air. I could hear the soft buzz of insects and the distant sound of water, probably the lake I had seen in the photos. I spent the afternoon unpacking and exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was dense and green, full of ferns and moss-covered rocks. A narrow path led down to the lake, where the water was calm and clear. The sun was warm on my skin, and the air smelled clean and sharp. That first evening, I built a fire outside in the small stone pit near the porch. The flames crackled, and the scent of burning wood mixed with the fresh pine. I cooked some beans and rice on the stove, ate quietly, and sat by the fire until the sun dipped below the trees. The sky turned deep blue, and the stars came out in full force, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. I went inside and got ready for bed. The loft was cozy but a little chilly. I stacked some wood next to the stove and lit a small fire to warm the room before I climbed into bed. The sounds of the forest at night were strange and new. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and an occasional bird calling in the darkness. It felt peaceful but also lonely in a way I wasn't used to. The next few days passed much like the first. I hiked the trails around the cabin, took pictures of the forest and the lake, read my book, and spent evenings by the fire. The isolation was refreshing, but after a while, I started noticing small things that unsettled me. At first, it was little sounds. Footsteps outside when I was sure I was alone, the creak of wood that sounded like someone walking on the porch, or the soft tapping of something against the cabin walls. I told myself it was just the wind or animals, raccoons or deer, moving through the brush. On the third night, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. The room was darker than before, the fire had died down, and the silence felt heavier. I heard the softest crunching noise outside the window near the loft. It wasn't the kind of sound the wind made. It was deliberate, slow, careful. My heart beat faster. I lay still, staring at the window but saw nothing through the dark glass except faint outlines of trees. I didn't hear anything else after a few minutes, so I told myself I was imagining things and tried to fall back asleep. But that feeling of being watched stayed with me. I thought about leaving the next day, but I didn't want to give in to fear just yet. Maybe the isolation was getting to me more than I realized. The following morning, I got up early and went for a longer hike. I took a different trail that looped around the lake and through thicker parts of the forest. The trees towered overhead, and the ground was soft with pine needles. As I walked, I found some broken branches and crushed leaves that looked fresh, as if someone had passed by recently. It was odd. The cabin was supposed to be private, miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen any other people since I arrived. I kept an eye out but saw no one. The forest was empty except for birds and squirrels. When I returned to the cabin, I checked the door locks and windows. Everything was intact. Still, the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered. That night, I took extra precautions. I locked every door and window, stacked extra firewood by the door, and kept my flashlight and a small pocket knife within reach. I left the cabin light on, even though it felt strange to do so in the middle of nowhere. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise downstairs. It was a soft thud, like something heavy dropping on the floor near the kitchen. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, trying to listen carefully. The cabin was otherwise silent except for the faint crackle of the dying fire. I stayed still for what felt like hours, but finally, the silence took over again. I debated going downstairs to check, but didn't want to risk it. Instead, I sat on the stairs, flashlight in hand, and waited until the sun began to rise. The next morning, I cautiously went down and inspected the kitchen. The floor was clear except for a small pile of dirt and leaves near the back door. It looked like someone had been there, brushing against the door frame or trying to open it, but there was no sign of forced entry. I realized then that someone had been outside the cabin at night. The thought terrified me, but I still didn't want to panic. Maybe it was a hunter or a local who didn't expect visitors. I decided to call my sister back in Portland to tell her about the situation. Luckily, the cabin had a spotty cell signal near the porch, just enough to get a message out. I sent a quick text explaining where I was and that I felt uneasy. I asked her to check in with me the next day. After that, I felt a little better, knowing someone knew my location. I spent the day making sure the cabin was secure. I reinforced the door with a piece of wood from the porch railing and tied the windows shut with rope I found in the shed outside. I gathered some extra stones to block the porch steps in case someone tried to climb up. That evening, I stayed close to the fire, keeping my knife nearby. The forest was alive with noises, but I tried to focus on the warmth and the crackling flames. Just before midnight, the same noise woke me again, the thud downstairs. This time, it was followed by another, then a scraping sound like someone dragging their hand along the wall near the door. I didn't move. I gripped the knife tightly and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the noises stopped. The silence returned, but my mind raced. Whoever was outside wasn't just wandering. They were trying to get inside. I sat there until dawn, exhausted and scared. When the sun rose, I looked outside and saw fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch, too big to be an animal's. They led into the woods and stopped about 50 feet from the cabin. The rest of the day I stayed inside, too afraid to go out. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew I couldn't stay there another night. That afternoon, I packed my things and prepared to leave. I wanted to get back to the city as fast as possible. On the drive back, my mind replayed every moment. The noises, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. I realized how vulnerable I had been in the middle of nowhere, how close I had come to something dangerous without even knowing. When I reached Portland, I called the local ranger station and told them about what happened. They said it wasn't the first time someone had reported strange noises or signs of trespassers near that area. Apparently, there were a few people who used the forest for illegal activities, poachers or squatters. People who didn't want visitors and might act violently to protect their hiding spots. I felt a mix of relief and gratitude. I had escaped without harm, but I also understood that nature wasn't the only danger out there. People, too, could be frightening when they didn't want to be found. After that trip, I never went back to that cabin or any remote place alone. I still love the forest and quiet, but now I'm more cautious, always aware that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you imagine, but the ones you never see coming. It was the fall of 2012 when I decided to spend a weekend alone at a small cabin deep in the woods near Lake Winthrop, in northern Vermont. I was 27 then, fresh out of a difficult breakup and craving solitude, a place far from the noise of the city and the reminders of my past. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a modest wooden structure my uncle had owned for years, passed down to me after he moved to Florida. He said it was the perfect spot to clear your mind. The drive out there was long but peaceful. I remember the narrow road weaving through dense forests, the leaves painted in reds, yellows, and oranges, flickering in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled crisp, cool, and earthy. As I pulled up to the cabin, I noticed how small it was. Just one room with a tiny kitchen and a wood stove. No electricity, no internet, no phone signal. I liked that. Promised escape. I unpacked slowly, careful not to rush. I brought some canned food, water, a flashlight, matches, and a thick blanket. My plan was simple. Spend 2 nights disconnected from everything and just read and think. The first night was quiet in the way I expected. The forest was alive with sounds. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves as small animals moved unseen. I lit the stove, letting the fire crackle and warm the cabin. The wooden floor creaked under my footsteps. The walls were thin, and I could hear every noise clearly. I found comfort in the isolation. I ate a simple dinner of beans and bread and settled down with a book. But by the second night, something had shifted. The sky had turned cloudy in the late afternoon, and the temperature dropped sharply. I kept the fire burning high and closed the cabin's windows tightly. Around midnight, I woke to a faint tapping sound on the roof. At first, I thought it was rain, but the rain had stopped hours ago. The tapping was slow, deliberate, rhythmic. I grabbed my flashlight and crept outside. The cold night air hit my face, and the forest felt different, heavier somehow, as if the trees were watching me. I circled the cabin, shining the light upward, but saw nothing except the bare branches against the dark sky. The tapping stopped abruptly. I shrugged it off as a branch knocked loose by the wind and returned inside. Still, the sound stayed with me. I lay awake for hours, listening to the occasional crack of a twig or the hoot of an owl. On the third day, I decided to explore the surrounding woods, hoping the exercise would clear my head. I packed a small bag with water and a compass and set off down a faint trail near the cabin. The woods were thick and the trees grew tall and close. The air was damp, and the smell of pine needles and wet earth filled my lungs. I walked for nearly an hour, stopping occasionally to look around or catch my breath. I found a small stream trickling through the rocks and sat down on a moss-covered log to rest. The sunlight filtered softly through the leaves, making patterns on the ground. Then I noticed something. Footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but as I looked closer, I saw they weren't human, at least not like mine. The prints were about the size of a large dog's paws, but much deeper and wider. The shapes were odd, almost like a mix between an animal and something else. My heart quickened, but I told myself it was probably just a big wild animal, maybe a bear or a large dog passing through. Still, the thought of a bear nearby made me uneasy. I decided to head back to the cabin and stay inside for the rest of the day. When I returned, the sun was low and a cold wind had picked up. I bolted the door and double-checked the windows. The woods seemed darker now, shadows stretching long and strange. Inside, I kept the fire burning and ate another quick meal. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time and from multiple directions. It wasn't on the roof alone, but on the walls, the windows, and the door. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the blackness. The wind howled and carried with it strange noises, growls, rustling, and something that sounded like heavy breathing. I stood frozen, trying to see through the darkness. Suddenly, a large shape darted past the edge of the clearing and into the woods. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. It was too big to be a deer or any normal animal I'd seen before. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I grabbed a heavy metal rod I kept near the stove for firewood and sat by the door, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Hours passed. The noises outside came and went, sometimes near, sometimes far, but always unsettling. I kept hearing the heavy breathing, the scraping of claws against wood and stone. At one point, I saw two glowing eyes in the darkness just beyond the porch. They watched me without blinking. I froze, afraid to move, to breathe. Then suddenly, the eyes vanished. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and silence. Morning could not come soon enough. When the pale light of dawn finally broke, I stepped outside cautiously. The forest was still and calm, but the ground told a different story. Around the cabin were dozens of deep prints like the ones I saw by the stream, large, wide, and deep. Some were right up to the porch steps. Others circled the cabin in an unnatural pattern. I realized then that whatever was out here was not just passing through. It was watching me, maybe even stalking me. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The isolation I'd once sought was now a trap. I packed my things quickly, throwing whatever I could into my bag. The prints led away from the cabin into the thicker part of the forest. I kept my eyes fixed on the shadows, my ears sharp for any sound. The walk back to my car was long and tense. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. Once, I caught a glimpse of those glowing eyes watching me from behind a tree, but I didn't stop. I kept moving forward, heart pounding, muscles tight. When I finally reached the road and saw my car, relief flooded through me like a wave. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest behind me looked calm and peaceful again, but I knew the truth. Something out there had been very close. Something that didn't belong, something wild and unknown. Back in the city, I told myself the whole experience was a strange encounter with wildlife, maybe a bear or a large predator. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something I was lucky to have escaped. Since then, I never went back to that cabin. I sold the property and never told anyone the full story. But sometimes, When the wind howls outside my apartment window, I swear I can hear that tapping, soft, slow, and steady, like something waiting just outside, watching, patient. It was the fall of 2003 when I first decided to get away from the city for a while. I was 29 years old, tired of the noise and the rush, desperate for quiet and space to think. I had always loved the woods, the smell of pine and earth after a rain, the way the wind could make the trees whisper without any people around. So I rented a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Vermont, a place I'd never been before but had read about as peaceful and wild. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of rough logs darkened by years of weather. It sat on the edge of a small clearing surrounded by thick woods, and the only way in was a narrow dirt road that twisted for miles through the trees. The place had no electricity, no running water, just a small wood stove for heat and a hand pump well outside for water. It was perfect for what I wanted: complete isolation. The first day I arrived, I carried in my bags and stacked wood by the stove. I unpacked canned food, some dry pasta, a bag of rice, and a small cooler with fresh meat and vegetables. I was alone except for my backpack, a flashlight, a couple of batteries, and a heavy-duty pocket knife. I wanted to live simply for a week. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the forest. That first night, I lay on the old mattress and listened to the sounds outside. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the branches scratch against the cabin walls. I heard an owl call somewhere far off, and the soft patter of rain on the roof. It was strange and new, but peaceful. The next day, I spent hours walking in the woods. The trees were tall and close together, their branches woven thick like a roof above my head. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, crunching softly underfoot. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, sharp and clean. I found a small stream and filled my water bottle, careful to avoid any murky patches. I collected some dry kindling and small branches for the fire later. Everything felt so alive and still at the same time. On the third day, I started to feel the solitude more deeply. There was no one to talk to, no radio or music, just the endless quiet except for the occasional birds and insects. I kept a notebook and wrote down my thoughts and what I saw around me, trying to keep my mind busy. But sometimes, in the silence, I felt a strange unease, like something unseen was watching from the shadows just beyond the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination. The cabin had one small window facing the clearing, and every evening I sat by it, staring out at the dark woods, watching the shapes of trees in the moonlight. The sky was so clear out here, I could see thousands of stars, more than I had ever seen in the city. The peace was almost overwhelming, but on the fourth night, things began to change. I was lying on the mattress, half asleep, when I heard a low thump outside the cabin, near the door. My heart jumped. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly got up, trying to be as quiet as possible. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy and still. I checked around the door and the porch. Nothing but wet leaves and broken branches on the ground. The thump had come again, softer this time, like something heavy falling nearby. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up and decided to keep the door locked. I sat back down, my knife on the small table beside me, and stared at the window until dawn. The next morning, I went outside to check for anything unusual. Near the cabin door, the dirt was disturbed, and I saw footprints. Large, wide, and unlike any animal prints I knew. They were heavy and deep, as if someone had been there the night before, walking carefully but leaving clear marks in the soft earth. I tried to think of what could have made those prints. Bears and deer came to mind, but the shape wasn't right. And there was no other sign of animals. No droppings, no fur, no scratch marks on the wood. Just the prints, and the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That day, I stayed close to the cabin, chopping more firewood and trying to keep busy. But I kept looking out into the trees, watching for any movement. Sometimes I saw shadows shift, branches snap, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. The nights grew harder to sleep through. Each time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone just outside, waiting. The wind sounded different, more like breath than air, and sometimes I thought I heard footsteps circling the cabin. I knew it was probably just the animals or the wind, but my mind refused to believe it. On the 6th day, something real happened. I was out collecting water from the well, carrying a bucket back to the cabin, when I heard a crunch behind me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight into the thick trees. There was a man standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. He wore a worn jacket and a cap pulled low, and his face was shadowed. I froze, gripping the bucket. He didn't say anything, just stared for a moment before turning and walking slowly back into the forest. I watched him disappear among the trees. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. That was the moment I realized I was not safe. This was no animal or random noise. Someone had been watching me all along. The footprints, the noises, the feeling of being followed, it was all connected. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the door locked, the knife ready. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, waiting, watching, listening for any sound. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed everything quickly, trying not to make noise, and headed to my car on the far end of the dirt road. The forest seemed darker now, less inviting. I didn't look back. On the way out, I noticed more footprints, leading from the edge of the woods toward the cabin. They were fresh, and they looked like they had been made by more than one person. I drove fast, not daring to stop until I was back on the paved highway. The city noise felt overwhelming after the quiet of the woods, but it was safer. Looking back, I think about that trip often. I wanted peace and solitude, but found something else entirely, something darker and real. The man in the forest, the footprints, the nights full of fear. They were a reminder that even in the most remote places, you are not always alone. Sometimes people wander into the woods for reasons you don't understand, and sometimes those reasons are dangerous. I never went back to that cabin. I never tried to find it again. But I carry the memory with me, a warning that quiet doesn't always mean safety, and that fear can live in the empty spaces just as much as life. It was the autumn of 1998 when I first set out to spend a week alone in the woods. I was 26 years old, tired of city life and constant noise. The cabin I rented sat deep in the forests of northern Vermont, about 30 miles from the nearest small town called Hardwick. The area was quiet and known for its dense pine forests and chilly, foggy mornings. I had driven for hours on a twisting country road, the kind that gets narrower the farther you go, until finally, I saw the cabin. It stood alone on the edge of a small clearing, made of rough logs, with a stone chimney that looked like it had seen many years. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the paint on the window frames was peeling. The smell of pine and earth filled the air, mixed with the scent of smoke from a nearby chimney. The cabin had no electricity, just an old oil lamp hanging by the door, and a wood stove inside for heating. The landlord had warned me to bring plenty of food and water because the closest store was miles away. I carried my bags inside, setting down my heavy backpack by the worn wooden table. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the sunlight that slipped through the dirty windows. I spent the first day unpacking and exploring the surroundings. Behind the cabin, the forest thickened quickly. The trees stood tall and close together, their needles covering the ground like a soft carpet. A narrow trail led down to a small lake about a quarter of a mile away, perfect for fishing or just sitting in silence. At night, the quiet was almost overwhelming. No hum of engines or city lights, just the sounds of wind in the branches and distant animal calls. I had brought a journal and some books to pass the time, but I mostly just sat by the stove, warming my hands and watching the flickering fire. On the second day, I decided to collect some firewood. The land around the cabin was littered with fallen branches and old logs, left to rot. I gathered a stack and carried it inside, knowing the nights would grow colder soon. While walking back, I noticed some strange tracks in the mud near the edge of the forest, large, deep, and uneven. At first, I thought maybe they were from a deer, but the shape was too irregular and the stride was too wide. Something about them unsettled me, but I told myself it was just a bear or some other wild animal common in the area. The third day passed quietly. I fished by the lake in the morning and walked along the trail, trying to enjoy the solitude. I found some wild berries and collected a handful. Back at the cabin, I prepared a simple meal and read by the window, the soft light fading as the sun dipped behind the trees. That night, the wind picked up. It rattled the old window panes and made the chimney smoke swirl in odd patterns. I lay in bed, the thin mattress creaking beneath me, and listened to the sound of branches scraping against the roof. The occasional distant howl or bark echoed across the valley. I didn't feel scared, just aware of how isolated I was. On the fourth day, something shifted. When I woke, the morning was foggy and thick, the kind of mist that made the forest look like a ghostly blur. I dressed quickly and went outside to check the firewood pile. It was disturbed. Some of the logs were moved, and there were more tracks in the mud near the porch. These prints were larger than before, and the ground looked like it had been scraped. My heart beat faster as I scanned the tree line, but I saw nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the cabin felt like a safe refuge. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other curious animal. Still, I kept my small hunting knife on the table nearby and made sure the doors were locked. Throughout the day, I noticed subtle changes. The trail to the lake was no longer as clear. Branches seemed broken or bent in ways that suggested someone, or something, had walked through recently. The quiet felt heavier, and even the birds were silent. I avoided going too far into the forest. That evening, as the light faded, I sat near the stove and sharpened a few sticks I had collected. I wanted to be ready if I needed to defend myself. The oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and every creak or crack outside made me jump. Suddenly, a loud noise came from the back of the cabin. A heavy thud followed by the sound of something dragging across the ground. I froze, listening intently. It went on for several seconds, then stopped. No footsteps followed. I held my breath, but the night remained still afterward. Couldn't sleep much. When dawn came, I looked out the window to find more signs. The firewood pile was scattered, and the doorframe had deep scratches gouged into the wood. The marks were fresh. I realized that whatever was coming near the cabin was testing me. I felt trapped. The forest that seemed so beautiful and calm before now felt like a cage. The fifth day was cold and overcast. I decided to explore a bit further despite my fear, hoping to find a way out if things got worse. I took my backpack, filled with essentials, and set off along the trail past the lake. The deeper I went, the more I felt eyes watching me. The forest was dense, and the fog had returned, muffling sounds and distorting shapes. I stumbled over roots and wet leaves, my breath visible in the chilly air. After about an hour, I found an old abandoned hunting cabin, almost hidden by vines and moss. Its windows were broken, and the door hung off one hinge. It looked like no one had been there for years. I thought about resting inside for a moment, but a strange feeling stopped me. The place was dark and smelled of decay. I hurried back to the trail and kept walking. As I made my way back to my cabin, I noticed fresh tracks all around, larger and more defined than before. They circled near the trees, some broken branches indicating something heavy moved through. I felt the weight of something dangerous lurking close. When I reached the cabin, I found the door open. I was sure I had locked it. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The place looked ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, and things were scattered on the floor. My food supplies were missing. Whoever or whatever had come had been inside. Fear hit me like a wall. I gathered my things quickly, grabbing only what I could carry. My plan was to leave immediately, to hike the few miles to the nearest road and hitch a ride back to town. But as I stepped outside, I heard it, a low growl from the woods behind the cabin. I froze and scanned the trees. Something large was moving, slow and deliberate, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I ran toward the trail, adrenaline pushing me forward. The ground was slippery with wet leaves, and my boots slipped several times. The growling grew louder and closer. I dared not look back. After several tense minutes, I reached a narrow dirt road I hadn't seen before. It was old and barely used, but it led downhill. I followed it, running as fast as I could. My breath came in ragged gasps, and every snap of a twig behind me made me flinch. Eventually, the growls faded. I kept running until I saw the faint outline of a car parked by a small bridge at the bottom of the hill. Relief flooded through me. I rushed forward and found a place to hide until I was sure I was safe. Then, I pulled out my phone and called for help. It took nearly an hour for a ranger to arrive and pick me up. The authorities told me later that the tracks I saw belonged to a large black bear, a rare but aggressive male known to roam the area. It had been hungry and territorial, possibly drawn to the smell of food in the cabin. They explained that bears sometimes investigate human cabins, looking for an easy meal, and can cause damage when frustrated. They warned me that being alone in such remote places carries serious risks. I never went back to that cabin. The experience left a mark on me. The forest wasn't just quiet and peaceful. It was wild, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous. I learned to respect that silence and the unseen eyes that watch from the shadows. I still love the woods, but now I carry caution with me. And I never underestimate the power of nature or the loneliness that comes with being truly alone. I remember the summer of 1998 like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 25 years. I was 26 then, craving a break from the city noise and the endless hum of computers at the office. The idea of spending a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. I found a small cabin rental about 2 hours from Portland, Oregon, nestled near the foothills of the Cascades. The place looked simple but cozy in the pictures. A weathered wooden cabin, surrounded by thick pine trees, a small creek nearby, and nothing else for miles. No neighbors, no cell signal. Just the kind of solitude I wanted. I packed the essentials. A few changes of clothes, canned food, a good flashlight, matches, a first aid kit, and a stack of books I meant to read but never got to. I also brought an old map and a compass, even though GPS was already becoming a thing. Better safe than sorry. I was nervous about going alone, but I convinced myself I'd be fine. I'd done weekend hikes before and spent nights camping in tents, but never quite like this, alone in a cabin, cut off from everyone. The drive out was peaceful. The highway gave way to winding back roads lined with thick forest. As I neared the cabin, the trees grew taller and closer together. The air smelled fresh and earthy. I parked in a small clearing and carried my bags up a narrow dirt path. When I reached the cabin, it was just as the pictures showed. Rough cedar logs, a tin roof streaked with rust, a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs that looked too weather-beaten to use. The windows were dusty, but clear enough to see inside. The door creaked as I opened it, the hinges groaning like an old man waking up. Inside, the cabin was small but well kept. There was a wood stove in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, a simple bed with a thin mattress, and a small sink connected to a water tank outside. No electricity, no running water inside, just what I expected. I put my bags down and took a deep breath, feeling the silence settle around me like a blanket. The first day passed quietly. I explored the surrounding woods, walked down to the creek where the water bubbled cold and clear, and collected some firewood. The sky was bright, the sun warm but not hot. At night, I built a fire in the stove, ate some canned beans, and read by the flickering light. I slept well, the kind of deep sleep that comes from being truly tired and disconnected. But things started to change on the second day. It began with small details that didn't quite fit. When I woke up, the door to the cabin was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had shut and locked it before going to bed. I found a few sticks of firewood had been moved from the pile I had gathered. At first, I thought maybe the wind had pushed the door open, or an animal had knocked the wood over. But as the day went on, more strange things happened. I heard footsteps outside the cabin late at night, soft, slow steps, like someone pacing just beyond the windows. The sound stopped whenever I turned on my flashlight and looked outside. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, or just the wind playing tricks on me. On the third day, I decided to explore a little further. I packed some food and headed down the creek, following it upstream. The forest thickened, the trees towering and dense, the light dimmer through the canopy. The path was narrow, the ground soft and mossy beneath my boots. After about an hour, I came across an old, abandoned logging road. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Cracked asphalt covered by dirt and leaves, trees growing through the cracks. I walked along it a bit, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger, prickling at the back of my neck. When I returned to the cabin, the door was open again. This time, I found something else. A small stone placed neatly on the porch step. It was smooth, dark, about the size of a fist. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand. There was nothing written on it, no markings, just a plain stone. A warning, maybe? I felt a chill run through me. I spent the rest of that evening checking all the locks, stacking firewood tightly against the door, and keeping my flashlight close. I didn't sleep much. Every creak, every rustle outside, made me sit up and listen, heart pounding. The next morning, the wind had picked up. Rain was forecast for the afternoon. I decided to stay inside and keep the fire going. As I settled in, I heard a loud thud on the roof, like a heavy branch falling. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside to check. The forest around the cabin was dense, but I could see a few broken branches scattered on the ground. I climbed up the small ladder to the roof carefully and saw a large branch had snapped off a nearby pine and landed on the roof's edge. No damage, thankfully, but it made me think how isolated and vulnerable I was. That night, the footsteps came again, louder and more deliberate. This time, I was sure it wasn't an animal. The pace was slow and heavy, like someone wearing boots. I sat frozen near the stove, listening as the steps circled the cabin. They stopped suddenly, right outside the door, then moved away. I kept my rifle close by. I had brought it for protection, even though I hated the idea of using it. I checked the bolt several times, heart hammering. I thought about leaving, but the rain made it impossible to drive. The dirt road would be slick and dangerous. On the fourth day, I woke to find footprints in the muddy soil near the creek. They were boot prints size 10 or 11, pressed deep in the soft earth. They led away from the creek toward the forest, but then stopped abruptly. No prints coming back. Someone had been nearby, close enough to leave those marks, but no sign of them afterward. I was starting to feel trapped. The forest that had seemed so beautiful now felt like a cage. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy and oppressive. I noticed how the trees seemed to loom closer, the shadows darker, even in daylight. That afternoon, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Someone had tampered with the water tank outside. The valve was slightly open, and the water level was lower than when I had checked the day before. Whoever had come near the cabin had tried to cut off my water supply. I checked all around the cabin, but there was no one in sight. I stayed inside the rest of the day, watching the windows carefully. Night came again, and with it the footsteps. They circled closer this time. I could hear breathing, low and ragged, beyond the walls. The steps stopped at the window nearest the kitchen. I shone my flashlight toward the glass. Nothing. Then the footsteps moved away. I knew then I wasn't alone, and I hadn't been all along. Someone was watching me, waiting for me to leave or give up. The next morning, I packed a small bag with my essentials, ready to make a run for it. The rain had cleared, and the road looked passable. I planned to leave at first light. Before I could step outside, I noticed something strange near the porch. A trail of small stones leading into the forest, similar to the one on the step, arranged deliberately, almost like a path or a message. I followed the stones, heart pounding. They led to a small clearing I hadn't seen before, hidden behind a thick wall of bushes and trees. In the clearing, there was a shallow hole, freshly dug, barely covered with loose dirt. The sight terrified me. Someone had been here recently, close to the cabin, digging. For what, I had no idea. Maybe hiding something, or trying to scare me away. I hurried back to the cabin and loaded my bags into the car. As I started the engine, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I couldn't see their face, just a dark silhouette against the green. Without thinking, I hit the gas and sped down the dirt road, mud flying up behind the tires. The figure didn't follow. After several minutes, I saw the highway and breathed a heavy sigh of relief. Back in the city, I reported what had happened to the local sheriff's department. They told me the cabin had a history of squatters and petty criminals using it as a hideout or base. It wasn't uncommon for strangers to lurk in the area, especially during summer months when fewer people lived nearby. They sent officers to check the cabin after I left. They found the hole in the clearing, but no one had been arrested. The forest around the cabin was vast and difficult to patrol regularly. That experience stayed with me for years. I never went back to that cabin or the woods nearby, but sometimes, late at night, I can still feel the weight of those footsteps circling outside, the cold dread of knowing I was being watched and trapped. I learned that nature's beauty can hide dangers, and solitude can turn into isolation very quickly. Most of all, I learned to trust my instincts. When something feels wrong, even if you don't know why, it usually is. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to spend a few days alone in the woods near a small town in northern Vermont. I was 27 then, burned out from city life and working long hours in a cramped office. The idea was simple: rent a remote cabin, disconnect from everything, and just be alone with nature. I wanted quiet, space to think, and maybe a little adventure. The cabin was old but sturdy, built sometime in the 1940s. Tucked away in a dense patch of forest not far from a narrow dirt road that connected to the nearest town. The place was basic: no electricity, no running water, just the bare bones. That was part of the appeal. I drove the 2 hours from Burlington early on a crisp October morning. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. The trees were a mix of deep green firs and deciduous trees that had started turning red, orange, and gold. I carried a small backpack with essentials: a few changes of clothes, canned food, a water filter, matches, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I also brought a thick wool blanket and a camping stove for heat and cooking. The cabin stood on the edge of a small clearing surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. It was a one-room cabin with rough wooden walls, a small stone fireplace, and a single window facing the forest. The floor creaked underfoot, and the roof showed signs of wear, but overall it felt safe enough. There was an old wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a cot with a thin mattress. The first day was peaceful. I set up the stove and boiled water for coffee, stretched out on the cot, and watched sunlight filter through the trees. The quiet was so deep it almost felt unnatural. No cars, no planes, no people. Just the occasional bird call or the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. I spent hours exploring the immediate area around the cabin, walking over moss-covered logs, picking up rocks and leaves, and breathing in the clean, crisp air. I took careful note of landmarks: a big oak tree with a broken branch, a narrow stream trickling nearby, and a fallen log I thought would make a good place to rest. Night came early in October, around 6 p.m., and the darkness settled quickly. I lit a fire in the fireplace, its warm orange glow filling the cabin. The crackling of the logs was soothing. I cooked some canned beans and ate slowly, savoring the silence. When I finally lay down on the cot, the cold air still clung to the corners of the room, but the blanket was thick, and I felt safe. That first night, I heard strange noises outside: the snapping of twigs, the soft rustling of leaves. At first, I thought it was animals moving through the forest. Deer, maybe, or raccoons. But the sounds sometimes felt closer, almost like footsteps. The wind was steady, making the trees groan and shake, adding to the eerie feeling. I tried to push the thoughts away and focused on the fire until it died down. I drifted off to sleep but woke a few times to the sounds. The next morning, I went outside early, hoping the daylight would clear my mind. The air was damp with morning fog, making everything look ghostly pale. I filled my water bottles from the stream, which ran clear and cold. While collecting water, I noticed something odd: a set of footprints in the soft mud along the bank. They were too large to be from any deer or small animal I knew. The prints looked like they were from a heavy boot, but I hadn't seen any other people around. The trail led away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I felt a chill but convinced myself it was probably someone passing by earlier or maybe a hunter. The area was popular for hunting during the fall. Still, it made me more alert. The second day was uneventful at first. I cleaned the cabin a bit, stacked firewood outside, and walked along the dirt road, hoping to get a sense of the distance to town. The road stretched out for about a mile before reaching a bend obscured by thick trees. There was no sign of any houses or cars. I realized just how isolated I really was. That evening, the noises outside became louder and more frequent. The footsteps were unmistakable this time. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. I stayed close to the fireplace, watching the shadows dance on the walls. The sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching came from different directions, sometimes right outside the window. At one point, I saw a faint shadow move past the window, barely visible in the dim firelight. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was an animal or the wind playing tricks on me. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, even though the cabin only had a simple wooden latch. Sleep was difficult. I lay awake listening to the sounds until exhaustion finally pulled me under. On the third morning, I decided to hike out to the nearest ranger station, about 3 miles down the dirt road, just to get supplies and check in. I packed a small bag with some food, water, and my map. The woods were dense, but the road was clear. As I walked, I kept my eyes open for anything unusual. About halfway there, I noticed fresh tire tracks on the road, heavy and wide, like from a large truck. That surprised me. I hadn't heard any vehicles since I arrived. The tracks seemed recent, as the mud was still soft and the edges crisp. I felt uneasy but kept walking. At the ranger station, I found a few workers, friendly but busy. I asked about the area and mentioned the cabin, but none of them seemed to know who might have been nearby. They warned me about increased bear activity in the region, which explained some noises and signs I'd seen. I bought some extra supplies and returned to the cabin by late afternoon. The sun was low, and the forest took on a golden hue. I hurried, wanting to be back before dark. That night was worse than before. The footsteps came again, but this time they were louder and more deliberate, circling the cabin like someone was watching me. I felt eyes on me through the darkness outside the window, but when I looked, nothing was there. The fire in the fireplace was low, and the cold crept into the room. I stuffed more wood in, desperate for warmth. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a hunter? Someone lost? Or worse, someone dangerous? I remembered the footprints from the stream and the tire tracks on the road. Something wasn't right. On the fourth day, I stayed mostly inside. I prepared more food and tried to distract myself by reading an old book I found on a dusty shelf. I thought about leaving early but wanted to finish the trip. I knew the roads could get bad with rain or snow, and I didn't want to be stuck. In the afternoon, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the forest in white. It muffled the sounds and made everything look strange and unfamiliar. I could barely see the trees just a few feet away. The isolation hit me hard. I sat near the window, flashlight by my side, and watched the fog swirl. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang on the door, a heavy, deliberate thud that made me jump. I froze, heart racing. The sound came again, then again, steady and forceful. It wasn't an animal. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door, peeking through a small crack. Nothing was there. Then I saw footprints in the mud outside, right next to the cabin. They were big, booted, and fresh. Whoever had been outside wasn't far. I locked the door tight and moved the table in front of it. My hands shook, but I tried to stay calm. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every sound made me jump. The wind, the creaking wood, the footsteps outside. I wondered how long I could keep this up alone. On the fifth day, I resolved to leave. I packed up most of my things, loaded the car, and planned to drive back to town. But before I left, I wanted to check the perimeter one last time. Walking around the cabin, I noticed something carved into the tree near the back. A rough symbol, like initials or a mark. It looked recent, as the bark was fresh and the cuts sharp. The symbol made no sense to me, but it was clear someone had been marking the area. Then, I spotted something else. a discarded pack of cigarettes near the tree. I didn't smoke, but the pack was crushed, dirt smeared across it. My unease grew. Someone had been watching me, maybe living nearby. I hurried back to the cabin, grabbed my last things, and drove down the dirt road. The engine roared and rattled, but it was a relief to be moving. As I left the forest behind, the sun was rising, casting a warm orange glow on the trees. The cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Back in town, I told the ranger about the footprints, the cigarette pack, and the mark on the tree. They took notes but shrugged it off, saying people came and went in the woods all the time, and sometimes hunters or trappers left signs. I never found out who had been near the cabin. Maybe it was a hunter passing through or someone hiding out. The thought unsettled me for a long time. Looking back, I'm glad I left when I did. The cabin trip was peaceful in parts, but those nights of footsteps and sounds taught me how quickly solitude can turn uneasy. I learned to respect the silence in the woods and the shadows that move just out of sight. Sometimes, danger doesn't come from ghosts or monsters, but from the unknown people who share the same. It was the autumn of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the constant noise of city life and escape to a remote cabin in northern Vermont. I was 28 years old then, working as a graphic designer in Boston, and the daily grind had worn me down. My small apartment felt cramped, and the streets outside seemed always crowded, busy, and loud. I needed silence, fresh air, and something different. Something that would remind me of what it felt like to be alone without the constant buzz of technology or people. I found the cabin through a small advertisement in a local Vermont magazine. It was owned by an older man who only rented it out in the fall and spring, claiming summer was too hot and winter was too cold. The cabin was tucked away near a lake called Mirror Pond, about an hour's drive from the nearest town, St. Johnsbury. I had never heard of it before, but the pictures showed a simple wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a small dock reaching into the water, and thick forest all around. I booked it for a week, and the night before I left, I packed a small bag with only the essentials: warm clothes, some canned food, bottled water, a few books, a flashlight, and my journal. I wanted this to be a place where I could think, write, and breathe. The drive from Boston was long, mostly along winding roads that became narrower and less traveled the closer I got to the cabin. The last 10 miles were dirt roads, and I had to drive slowly, avoiding potholes and tree branches hanging low. When I finally arrived, the sun was just setting, casting a soft orange glow through the trees. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even better in person. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and maples, some of their leaves already turning bright reds and yellows. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine needles and damp earth. A wooden sign hung crooked on the front door with the name Pine Hollow Cabin carved into it. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. There was a living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a rusty old stove, and a tiny bedroom with a creaky bed. Dust covered most surfaces, and it was clear no one had been here for weeks. The windows were single panes, and the glass was slightly foggy. I unpacked my things slowly, placing my clothes in the small closet and my food on the counter. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry, and the flames quickly took hold, filling the room with warmth and a soft orange light. Outside, the forest was dark and still except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of a distant bird. I sat near the fire and wrote in my journal about how peaceful it was to be so far from the city. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the cabin floor. I decided to explore the area before breakfast. I put on my boots and stepped outside, breathing deeply. The air was crisp, and a faint mist hovered over the lake, giving it a mirror-like surface as the name suggested. The forest around the cabin was dense but not too thick to walk through. I followed a narrow trail along the lake's edge, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I spotted a few deer tracks near the water and some scattered pine cones crushed beneath what I guessed were squirrels or rabbits. About a half-mile down the trail, I came across an old wooden dock. The boards were weathered and a little wobbly, but it stretched out into the water, which was surprisingly clear. I knelt down and looked beneath the surface, seeing small fish dart between rocks and plants. The lake was quiet except for the occasional splash of a jumping fish or the rustle of wind through the trees. As the day passed, I settled into a simple routine. I chopped some firewood, cleaned the cabin a little, and spent hours reading and writing. The silence was almost overwhelming at times. Without the usual city sounds, I became painfully aware of every small noise: the creak of the cabin floor, the tapping of branches against the window, even my own breathing. That evening, while I prepared dinner over the stove, I noticed the wind had picked up. Outside, the trees began to sway and the leaves rattled loudly. I made sure the fire was well stoked and the windows closed tight. After eating, I sat by the fireplace again, but this time the darkness outside felt heavier. Shadows from the flickering flames stretched and moved on the walls, making the small room feel oddly alive. It was on the third day that things began to feel off. I woke early again as usual, but the forest outside was unusually quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels darted through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural. I decided to take a longer walk that morning, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. I packed a small backpack with water, some crackers, and my camera, then followed a faint path leading deeper into the woods behind the cabin. The forest grew thicker with older trees and tangled bushes. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and fallen branches. I noticed small clearings every so often, places where the sun broke through the canopy and lit up the forest floor with soft golden light. About an hour in, I came to a small stream. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. I knelt down and filled my bottle, then sat on a nearby rock to rest. It was peaceful again here, but a strange feeling crept over me, like I was being watched. I looked around carefully but saw no one. Only the trees, the moss, and the stream. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I decided it was time to head back. On the way back, I noticed something strange on the ground near the trail. A set of footprints. They were fresh. I could tell from the soft soil and lack of debris inside the prints. The prints were too big to be from any animal, clearly made by a human boot or shoe. I frowned. I hadn't seen or heard any other people since I arrived. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, and the owner said no one else rented it during my stay. I followed the prints carefully, wondering if someone else was nearby. The prints led back toward the cabin, but then suddenly stopped near a thicket of bushes. I stood there trying to decide what to do. The sun was still high, and I was deep enough in the woods that I could see the cabin's roof through the trees. I decided to head back quickly, keeping an eye out for anything else. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and checked all the windows. Nothing seemed disturbed inside. I didn't find any signs of other people. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the cabin made me jump, and I kept checking the locks on the door. I even kept the fire going longer than usual, staring into the flames until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. The next day, I found more signs that someone had been close. Outside the cabin, near the back door, there were fresh footprints again. They weren't from my boots. They were larger, heavier, and moved in a pattern that suggested someone had been pacing. I didn't leave the cabin that day. Instead, I stayed inside, watching through the windows as the forest swayed in the wind. I checked my phone. There was no signal out here, which made me feel even more isolated. Late in the afternoon, I decided to take one last walk to the dock and sit by the lake. I needed to clear my head. The sky was overcast, and a chilly wind blew across the water. The surface rippled, reflecting gray clouds. As I sat on the edge of the dock, I felt the same strange tension from before, like I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I saw movement in the trees across the lake. Something or someone walking near the opposite shore. My heart quickened. I couldn't see clearly, but it looked like a figure, tall and slow-moving. I stayed frozen for several minutes, watching, but then the figure disappeared behind the trees. I returned to the cabin as quickly as I could, locking the door behind me. That night, I kept the fire blazing, and I placed heavy furniture in front of the windows and door. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. The peaceful retreat I had imagined had turned into something else. A trap, a place where I wasn't truly alone. I packed my bags quickly and drove back the way I came, eyes constantly on the rearview mirror. When I reached the main road, I stopped at a small diner and called the cabin owner. He sounded surprised and a little worried when I told him what had happened. He explained that the cabin had been empty for years except for the brief periods when he rented it out. He said there had been rumors of people sneaking onto the property, hunters or campers who didn't want to pay or who used the forest for their own reasons. He advised me to report what I saw to the local sheriff, which I did. The sheriff told me that illegal campers and hunters sometimes used the forest to hide out, and that the area was known for occasional trespassing, but nothing violent had been reported. In the weeks that followed, I stayed away from the cabin and the forest. I kept checking the news and local reports, but never heard about anything unusual. Looking back, I realize how quickly a place can change from peaceful to frightening when you feel watched and trapped. That experience taught me to respect the wilderness, but also to trust. I remember the cabin being small, weathered by years of cold mountain winters and hot summer days. It sat off the beaten path in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, a place I had rented for a week to get away from the noise of the city and the mess of everyday life. It was the summer of 1997, and I was 28 years old. I hadn't told anyone I was coming, just packed my old backpack and drove out to that quiet place by myself. The idea was simple. No phone, no distractions, just me, the woods, and the cabin for a week. The drive from Charlotte was long but beautiful, winding through narrow roads flanked by tall trees that seemed to grow closer as I went deeper into the mountains. I passed a few small towns, each with a few shops and wooden signs swinging in the warm breeze. I felt the tension inside me ease with every mile. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. It was an old structure, made of dark wood that had faded to gray with age. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were small and dusty. A thin trail led from the front door into the trees. It looked abandoned at first glance, but the owner had assured me it was perfectly safe and stocked with essentials. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, a tiny bathroom with a cold water sink and an old toilet, and one room with a bed and a threadbare blanket. The floor creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood and pine. I unpacked my bag, lit a fire in the stove, and sat down at the table, feeling a rare kind of peace. No cell service, no emails, no deadlines, just quiet. That first night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the crack of twigs as something moved in the shadows. It was a little unsettling, but also comforting in a strange way. I told myself it was just nature, nothing to be afraid of. I drifted off to sleep with the fire flickering beside me. The next morning, I woke to the pale light filtering through the dusty windows. The forest outside was thick and green, the leaves shimmering with dew. I brewed some coffee on the stove and sat on the small porch, watching the mist rise from the trees. I planned to spend the day hiking one of the nearby trails, maybe take some photos of the wildflowers and birds. I felt a quiet thrill of freedom, the kind that comes from being truly alone in a wild place. I locked the cabin door behind me and headed down the trail, the gravel crunching under my boots. The forest was alive with insects buzzing and birds calling. The path was narrow and winding, sometimes steep, but the air was fresh and cool. I walked for hours, stopping to rest beside a stream where the water ran clear over smooth stones. I drank from the bottle I carried and ate some trail mix. Felt good to be away from everything. When I returned to the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun was low and golden. The shadows in the forest had grown long. I felt tired but content. I built another fire in the stove, boiled some water, and made a simple dinner from canned beans and bread I had brought. I sat by the fire, reading a book I'd brought, the pages soft in the flickering light. As night fell, the forest sounds grew louder and stranger. Somewhere nearby, an animal called out with a low, guttural growl. I felt a chill run down my spine, but reminded myself it was just a bear or a coyote. I closed the windows and drew the curtains, trying to block out the dark. On the third day, I noticed something odd. The firewood I had stacked outside was disturbed, some pieces scattered on the ground. At first, I thought the wind had knocked them over, but the air was still and dry. I checked the perimeter of the cabin and found faint footprints in the soft earth near the back door. They were too small to be a deer or any large animal, maybe a dog or a person. I felt a twinge of unease but shrugged it off. Maybe a hunter or another visitor had been nearby and didn't realize anyone was staying there. That night, I double-checked the locks and kept the fire burning longer. I sat by the window watching the dark woods, eyes straining to make out shapes between the trees. Every rustle made my heart race. I told myself to stay calm, but the quiet felt heavier now, as if something unseen was watching me. The next morning, I found my firewood pile even more scattered, and the footprints were closer to the cabin. There were also marks on the doorframe, scratches, shallow but distinct, like claws or a sharp object scraping the wood. I searched the surrounding area for any signs of a person or animal, but found nothing else. My skin prickled with a mix of fear and confusion. I decided to stay inside most of the day, reading and keeping the fire going. The isolation felt less like peace now and more like a trap. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me wanted to understand what was happening. I couldn't explain why, but something about the place made me stay. That evening, I heard a noise outside, soft footsteps crunching on gravel, then silence. I didn't dare look out, but I could feel eyes on me, something just beyond the edge of the porch light. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stayed inside, clutching a kitchen knife I kept in a drawer. When morning came, I found a note slipped under the door. It was written in messy, uneven handwriting. "You shouldn't be here. Leave." My hands shook as I held the paper. There was no signature, no explanation, just those 3 words. I tried to convince myself it was some prank, but the fear was real and sharp. I felt watched, hunted even. I knew I had to leave, but the road out was long and winding, and the nearest town was miles away. The only way was to walk down the gravel path and back to my car parked at the main road. But I was afraid to step outside. I spent the day checking and rechecking the cabin. Doors locked, windows shut tight. I even piled some furniture in front of the door, hoping it would stop anyone from coming in. But the feeling of being trapped grew heavier. That night, the noises came again. Footsteps around the cabin, scraping sounds, low growls that didn't sound quite like an animal. I stayed up all night, sitting by the fire with the knife on my lap, listening. The hours crawled by like they would never end. Just before dawn, I heard something at the back door, heavy breathing, then silence. I waited with bated breath until the first light of morning filtered through the curtains. When I finally stepped outside, the door was scratched deeper. The wood splintered where someone had tried to force it open. The furniture blocking the door was knocked aside, trampled into the dirt. I didn't want to stay another moment. I packed as fast as I could, grabbed my bag, and hurried down the trail to my car. Every crack of a branch, every rustle made me jump. I kept looking behind me, half expecting someone to be following. The drive back down the mountain felt like a blur. The sun was up, the roads dry, but I didn't stop until I reached the gas station in the nearest town. I bought a phone card and called a friend to come get me. Looking back, I think what scared me most wasn't the noises or the footsteps. It was the feeling of being watched, and the fact that someone else had been there, unseen, stalking that cabin. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone who wanted the place for themselves. Maybe someone just looking for a way to scare off a stranger. I never found out who it was or why they targeted me. When I told the local sheriff, he nodded and said the area was known for occasional break-ins and people who didn't want visitors. But no one had ever seen anyone. No arrests, no explanations. I didn't return to that cabin or that part of the woods. The The experience stayed with me for years. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts but other people, and the wild places where no one is watching over you. In the end, I'm just glad I left alive and unharmed. The cabin itself was innocent, just old wood and silence. But the fear came from something very real. The presence of another human, someone who didn't want me there, and who wasn't afraid to make sure I knew it. That kind of fear stays with you. It's not easy to forget. I arrived at the cabin in late October, just as the sun was setting behind the dense pine trees that crowded the hillside. The year was 1998, and I was 26 years old, craving some time alone away from the noise of the city. My name is Aaron. I worked as a graphic designer in Seattle, a job that paid the bills but wore me down with deadlines and the humdrum of constant human contact. The idea of a quiet weekend in the woods, a cabin I had rented deep in the Cascade Mountains, sounded like a much-needed escape. The drive up was slow but peaceful. The road narrowed and twisted more and more until it became a gravel track barely wide enough for my old Honda. Leaves, yellow and orange, littered the path, making a soft crackling sound under the tires. The air smelled cold and fresh, carrying a faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. I had passed a few other cabins on the way, all dark and still, their windows like blank eyes in the growing dusk. But mine was supposed to be at the very end of the trail, secluded and quiet. The cabin came into view as I rounded the last bend, a small wooden structure perched at the edge of a clearing surrounded by tall evergreens. Its paint was peeling, faded green against the browns of the forest. Smoke curled from the chimney, which meant the previous renters or caretaker had recently been here. That was a relief because I had heard stories about cabins being left open and vulnerable, inviting all kinds of trouble. I got out of the car, feeling the cool chill of the evening settle on me. The air was crisp enough to sting my cheeks, but I was dressed in layers. A thick flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt, jeans, and sturdy boots. I had packed well: camping gear, extra blankets, a good supply of canned food, a lantern, and a large flashlight. Cell service was patchy here, but I had a satellite phone just in case. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small living room with a wood stove against one wall, a rickety couch covered in a faded plaid blanket, and a kitchen area with old cabinets and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, disturbed only by the light from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. I set my bag down and went to the woodpile outside to bring in some logs for the stove. The cabin smelled like old wood and something faintly musty, maybe dampness from the forest. I closed the door behind me and started a fire, feeding it dry kindling until the flames grew and crackled. The warmth spread quickly, making the cabin feel less lonely. I settled in with a book and some coffee, watching the fire flicker and the shadows dance on the walls. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt relaxed, a quiet peace I hadn't known in months. Night fell quickly. I kept the fire burning and ate a simple dinner of canned beans warmed on the stove. Later, I lay on the couch, a thick blanket pulled over me, and tried to read, but my mind wandered. The quiet was almost too complete, as if the woods had swallowed every sound. There were no distant cars, no dogs barking, no airplanes overhead, just the slow breathing of the forest. Around midnight, I heard something outside, soft but deliberate. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon rummaging through the underbrush. The sound was a light crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, listening. It came from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of trees that framed the cabin's windows. The fire's glow made the glass glimmer, and I could just make out movement in the shadows. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam slowly across the clearing. Nothing. The beam caught on a tree trunk, a rock, then a patch of dark brush. Whatever had been there was gone. My heart was beating faster, but I told myself it was probably just a stray animal, maybe a coyote or an owl hunting. Still, I locked the door and checked the windows before heading back to the couch. I left the fire burning bright, the flames crackling like a small guard. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I was safe and alone. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling through the window and birds calling in the trees. I made breakfast and went outside to explore. The air was colder now, with a frost starting to form on the grass and fallen leaves. The forest was quieter in daylight, but I noticed signs of life. Tracks in the dirt, broken twigs, and scattered pine cones. While wandering near the cabin, I found fresh footprints in the soft earth. They were large, human-shaped, and led from the edge of the trees to the clearing. The prints were too big to be mine and looked recent, the mud still moist. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here last night. I circled the cabin, careful not to leave my own tracks over theirs. The prints went around the back, toward the forest. I followed them cautiously, the trees growing denser and the light dimmer. The sound of a small creek nearby guided me. About 50 yards into the woods, the footprints stopped abruptly. The ground was disturbed, as if someone had crouched or knelt there. I scanned the area. There were broken branches and flattened grass, but no other signs of a person. That afternoon, I tried calling my friend back in Seattle, but the signal was weak. I sent a brief text and hoped for a reply. The solitude, which had felt comforting before, now pressed in on me. I kept the fire going, checked the locks, and stayed alert. That evening, as darkness settled again, the sounds returned: footsteps, crunching leaves, and now something else. The faint sound of breathing outside the cabin made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the old wood and every whistle of the wind seemed amplified in the stillness. The third day was colder, and I decided I wouldn't stay longer than planned. But before leaving, I wanted to make sure I understood what was happening. I took my small pocket knife and a heavy flashlight and walked the perimeter of the clearing again. This time, I found something I hadn't seen before: scratches on the wooden siding of the cabin, low to the ground, jagged and deep. They looked fresh, and there were smudges of dark dirt or dried blood near them. My heart pounded as I realized someone or something had been trying to get inside. I thought about calling the police, but my phone had little signal, and I didn't want to make a scene or risk getting stranded longer. Instead, I sat tight, stayed inside, and prepared for the night. When darkness came again, the noises outside grew louder, more insistent. Footsteps circled the cabin, sometimes pausing, sometimes retreating. I could hear heavy breathing and low grunts. I gripped my knife and flashlight, waiting for dawn. At some point in the night, I heard a sharp knock on the door, a single, loud rap that shook the frame. I didn't move, didn't respond. The knocking didn't come again. Eventually, the sounds faded, replaced by the quiet that stretched long into early morning. When I woke, I packed quickly and drove back down the mountain, not looking back. The feeling of being watched stayed with me for hours. It was only a few days later, back in Seattle, when the news reported a man had been caught trespassing and breaking into cabins in that area. He was desperate, hiding from the law and struggling with addiction. No one had been hurt, but the terror he caused was real. I thought about that man, about the fear and hunger that drove him into the woods, breaking into places where people tried to find peace. And I was grateful to be safe, to be back among people, and to leave the silence of the forest behind.